All quiet, so why don't we get going? Are you ready? Okay. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to call to order the study session for the City Council for the City of Wheat Ridge, Colorado for October the 7th, 2019. Our first order of business is citizen comment on agenda items. If I have a sign-up sheets, and if you would like to speak on any item that is on the agenda, you may do so by coming to the microphone, and I will call your name, and when you get to the microphone, if you would adjust it so that we can hear you clearly, give us your first name and last name. If you would spell your last name, that helps get it correct in the record, and then give us your address, and you'll have 3 minutes to speak on the item you wish to speak on. So our first speaker this evening looks like Steve Parker and Scott Plummer on deck. And you'll see some lights go on in there, and I think when the green one goes off, it starts blinking, you have about 30 seconds left, and the yellow goes on, and the red goes on after that. And when it gets red, your time is up.
Great.
All right, thank you.
All right, my name's Stephen Parker, P-A-R-K-E-R, and my address is 7903 Allison Way. It's in Arvada. I'm speaking on behalf of the Arvada Fire Protection District as the fire marshal. Like I said, I'm the fire marshal of the Arvada Fire Protection District, and I'd like to thank the city staff and the BCAB for their support in our discussions for the upcoming code adoption. And I'm here specifically to speak in favor of maintaining the prescriptive residential fire sprinkler requirements in townhouses. Residential fire sprinklers were first conceived in 1930, and those began being designed and promoted in single-family dwellings. In 1973, the National Commission on Fire Prevention and Control issued its comprehensive report called America Burning. This report indicated 7 of 10 fires occur in residential occupancies. 84% of fire fatalities occur in those residential occupancies. They go on to state that the most effective fire loss prevention and reduction measure with respect to both life and property is the installation and maintenance of fire sprinkler systems. This was in 1973. At that time, the U.S. Fire Administration supported the development of improved automatic extinguishing systems for residential occupancies. Shortly after, in 1975, NFPA 13D was published. This technology is not before its time. In fact, it was realized over 46 years ago that residential sprinklers serve a vital role in the life safety of people in residential structures. Residential sprinklers were finally introduced as a minimum prescriptive life safety feature in single-family dwellings in the 2009 edition of the International Code Set. Although there have been numerous jurisdictions to maintain these minimum standards, there has not been enough. Most recent statistics show that 79% of fires and 97% of fatalities are occurring in residential structures. These numbers could be lower if more jurisdictions maintain the minimum prescriptive code requirements. These systems have added benefits that are not talked about as often as they should. For potential and future developments within the city of Wheat Ridge, there are specific allowances that the fire code can consider due to the installation of those systems. Narrower fire apparatus access roads, fewer fire apparatus access roads, longer distance between hydrants, lessened fire flow, therefore smaller water main sizes, and various allowances can be taken advantage of out of the residential code. As recent as last Friday, we had a fairly significant fire at 44th and Tabor. Although this was not a single-family residence, there are many similarities. Arvada Fire and West Metro had over 30 personnel on scene, 14 apparatus responded to extinguish the fire. 5 people were transported, approximately 9,000 gallons of water were used. Toxic fumes admitted into the atmosphere, fire debris runoff into the stormwater system. 6 families displaced, shutdown of a major thoroughfare during rush hour, and significant damage to over 60% of the structure.
Can you wrap up in a minute or two?
Yeah, I got about 30 seconds.
Okay, good.
If this fire occurred in a residential structure protected with a residential sprinkler system, the fire would have been contained to the room of fire origin, fire damage contained to a single unit, displace only one family for a shorter duration, and could be controlled with less than 400 gallons of water. The benefits of residential sprinklers are far-reaching and will provide for a much safer community than the city of Wheat Ridge. Please join some of our neighboring communities by ensuring the residential sprinklers are maintained as a minimum prescriptive life safety requirement. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Scott Plummer and Heidi Williams on deck.
Good evening. My name is Scott Plummer, Plumer. My address is 7903 Allison Way in Arvada, and I'm here on behalf of the Arvada Fire Protection District. I'm the Deputy Fire Marshal with Arvada Fire, and I'm here tonight to speak in favor of maintaining the prescriptive code requirement for fire sprinklers in townhomes. I'd like to speak a little bit about how they're designed and how they operate, their reliability as a result of design, and what we as Arvada Fire can do to help developers and builders in the plan review and inspection process for residential fire sprinklers. Residential fire sprinkler systems are designed to control a fire in a residential structure before the fire can grow to a dangerous point. Fire sprinklers only operate in response to heat or mechanical impact. If one goes off, they do not all go off. Not only do they require heat to activate, it is a high temperature that is required. So simply burning food in the oven or popcorn in the microwave will not activate the sprinklers. These systems are so reliable and so effective that in 97% of fires in sprinklered buildings, they are controlled by one sprinkler. My colleague lives in a townhome with fire sprinklers and 2 young children. Even with 2 children playing in the house, the sprinkler system has not activated. The likelihood of an unintentional activation is extremely low. Some concerns have been raised about having qualified installers for these systems. The state of Colorado does regulate fire sprinkler fitters and suppression companies. To date, there are over 130 companies registered in the state of Colorado to install fire sprinkler systems. There are also over 450 individuals registered in the state of Colorado to install fire sprinkler systems. I'd like to take a quick minute to address the concerns regarding the cost of these systems. A research study was conducted in 2008 to examine the cost of installation. Amongst the technical panel members were members of the National Association of Home Builders. This study showed that the average cost to install a home fire sprinkler system was $1.61 per sprinklered square foot. Costs range from 38 cents to a high of $3.66 per sprinklered square foot. Now, the low end comes out of California, where there's a large development, and the installer was able to leverage some quantity and volume cost. And the high system actually comes out of state of Colorado, where the system was coming off well water with copper sprinkler pipe and an antifreeze system. These costs actually included all of the design, installation, permit, tap fees, water meter fees, all included in that $1.61 per square foot. The National Fire Protection Association estimates that the cost at $1.35 per square foot. Locally, we have data from the city of Westminster that shows that since their adoption of residential fire sprinklers, costs are $1.64 per sprinklered square foot. Now, we also excluded the low and high numbers out of that, so it's a very realistic value. Therefore, we can say that the cost to install a sprinkler system is very reasonable. Homeowners are likely to spend more upgrading their flooring than on a fire sprinkler system. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to a Wheat Ridge that is safer due to residential fire sprinklers.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Heidi Williams and Rachel Holteen on deck.
Good evening, Heidi Williams, Williams, address 9033 East Easter Place in Centennial. I'm with the Home Builders Association. So I know you all got my letter that I sent, and I appreciate the comments before and understand, especially in an apartment situation where you would definitely want to have residential fire sprinklers in those multi-family units for egress and other really important reasons. However, the builders that I represent are building townhomes with 2-hour firewalls. And so basically what that means is that we're building these individual units in a townhome that is going to keep the fire from going into the next unit. Now the roof could, share some damage, but overall those units, we're not finding those fires spreading into the additional units. Additionally, in the newer products, we're using very good fire retardant material that is required in the code. And so we're not seeing that those additional costs are necessary. And I know that those low dollar amounts were quoted as far as being important for the data in Colorado, but what we're seeing is really more like $3 to $5 a square foot. And so just $1 per square foot alone is on the design costs, and then you have to add in all of the other fees as well. So we're definitely seeing higher costs in that. And what I would want to urge you is that townhome product is more of the attainable workforce housing that we're all trying to get into our cities so that people can come in and live, work, and play, and afford to live, work, and play in our communities. So that attainable product, if you're going to add $5,000 to $8,000 more for that product, for every $1,000 in the Denver metro area, you push out 1,300 people from being able to afford that home. So again, if you're focused on attainable and affordable housing, this is one way that you can really affect that by not adding these additional costs. So I appreciate your time, and I appreciate those of you who called me back, and I hope you have a great meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Rachel Hulteen and Kelly Brooks on deck, and I'll ask our clerk to reset the timer.
Good evening. My name is Rachel Hulteen, and I'm going to keep this brief tonight. I'm just here to speak with enthusiasm that the city is considering additional forms of input for citizens to get involved in the city. I'm really excited to see that you guys are looking at the platform that I believe is the same one that Lakewood uses, that allows for citizens to provide input without actually having to come to city council. A lot of us love coming to city council, but Monday nights don't always work. And there are a lot of people who can't leave their homes for different reasons. So I'm excited that we're taking this step to be more inclusive with our processes. And I really encourage, as the city moves forward with this, to also complement it with how are we making sure people know about this opportunity and keeping them informed so that it's not just available to them, but they're aware of it and aware of when issues are coming up for them that's important and that they may want to get involved in the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Kelly Brooks.
Good evening. My name is Kelly Brooks, B-R-O-O-K-S. My address is 433 South Allison Parkway. I'm a deputy fire marshal with West Metro Fire Protection District. I'm here on behalf of Fire Marshal Bruce Kroll, who regrets he can't attend this evening due to being on vacation. First, my colleagues with Arvada Fire have done an outstanding job of representing the position of your fire districts regarding the requirement for residential sprinkler systems. I have nothing to add other than the fact that West Metro Fire Rescue is in full support of maintaining the residential fire sprinkler requirement as written and not lowering the level of safety provided by the code by amending out the requirements for residential sprinklers. Second, I'd like to make a few comments regarding underground detention to highlight the concerns that prompted our recommendation to limit the installation of underground water detention facilities under fire access lanes. First, it is important to differentiate the ways in which the fire department utilizes fire lanes. First, under normal conditions, fire department apparatus are like any other large commercial vehicle with relatively standard weight distribution and conventional driving characteristics, albeit heavy and cumbersome. However, from the fire department's standpoint, the primary use of a fire lane is not limited to just driving access, but for use during actual fire operations as well. These operations can put significant stress on the immediate infrastructure, including structural pressures that go well beyond anything a typical roadway endures under normal conditions. Case in point, the fire department will usually deploy a ladder on an aerial apparatus on most structure fires. In doing so, the full weight of the apparatus, 85,000 pounds, is transferred from 3 axles and 6 wheels to 4 outriggers, each no more than 18 inches square. This condenses that 85,000 pounds over a much smaller area that exceeds the design threshold utilized by the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials standard HS20. The weight distribution problem is then compounded by the fact that the ladder is typically deployed off one side or the other, thereby shifting much of the vehicle weight to one side and just 2 outriggers. Then, to make conditions worse, the fire department will likely be applying roughly 2,000 gallons per minute of water to the site and ultimately to the detention structure, further inducing stress on the underground facilities. We have yet to find a structural or civil engineer who is comfortable with this scenario I have outlined. Obviously, this is a concern for fire districts, and therefore we felt it necessary for the safety of our firefighters and the well-being of our apparatus to recommend and encourage more specific parameters for the design and lifetime performance of underground water detention facilities that reside under fire lanes. So with that said, we encourage you to consider HS 20, but with consideration given to the point load requirements that address outrigger deployment, as well as an engineered design that specifically addresses fire department apparatus design conditions. Please feel free to contact me or Fire Marshal Bruce Krall if we can answer any questions. Thanks for your time and for the opportunity to speak to you tonight.
Thank you. That's all of the speakers that I have signed up to speak. Is there anyone here who hasn't signed up that would like to speak on any item on the agenda? You may come now. All right, I don't see anybody, so we will close our public comment and move to our agenda item number 1. This is the Crisis Intervention Team and Case Manager Co-Responder Program. Mr. Goff.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Our Division Chief, Jim Lorentz, is here to give a quick update on this exciting new program.
Welcome, Chief Lorentz. Take it away.
Thanks, Mayor. Thanks, Mr. City Manager, Council. Good evening. So this is a program of police mental health collaboration. We've been working in a CIT program for several years. That's Crisis Intervention Team. That's special training that police officers go through to be able to deal with crisis intervention, de-escalation techniques for people with mental illness, mental health problems. And it's been very effective. It's been very effective for several years. Wheat Ridge has about 90% of its officers trained in CIT, which is higher than most. You know, we're missing that 10%, but we've got people in the academy or people in training. So we're always going through training every few months to have a different group join us. Certainly the advantages are mental health crisis is difficult to access sometimes, especially for people that have mental health issues. So in general, people call the police most often when there's something going on. So police get there. If they don't have any specific training, it can be difficult. We find about 20% of people in jails and prisons have some type of mental illness. So what we'd really like to do is get that positive connection to the mental health system, reduce those encounters with law enforcement, and when we do have an encounter, it's a positive one. So the next step is to have a co-responder that would be a behavioral health manager, that would be master's level training counselor to ride with a police officer. This has been going on for a few years in some communities across the country. Jefferson County has had one in the south part of the county for a couple of years, and they have great results as part of that program. So we've been trying at Wheat Ridge to get our own program since 2017. I started working on that. We did a request for a grant, and we didn't get it. We lost, but we came back last year and wrote another grant, and we've been successful. So Jefferson County is administering this grant. We don't have any responsibility of the grant, which is kind of good. Jefferson County will take care of all of those needs, and we partner with Golden and the county to get 2 co-responders for this grant to operate in this northern area, northern Jeffco and west to Golden and Wheat Ridge. So we'll share these 2 responders. We'll take turns. They'll take turns riding with the different agencies. If something comes up in another agency, say something comes up in Golden while they happen to be riding in Wheat Ridge, we'll drive them over there and set them up that way. So we make the most use of the resources that we have. And We think that this is going to be very helpful. The early statistics from southern Jefferson County are promising. So what I would promise to you is that over the course of this year, as we do this grant, we'll give you some updates and let you know statistically what's going on, how successful it's been, because the grant will run out in 1 year. And then we'll have to make a decision as to do we want to continue this program and how are we going to fund it, all those kinds of questions. Will the 3 partners all stay involved? If they do, this can reduce the cost quite a bit for each one. So I think that covers about everything that I want to say. If you have any questions, I could answer.
Questions? Thank you, Division Chief Lorentz. Mr. Goff?
Yeah, if there's no questions with council, from council, I want to, Jim, don't leave. I want to recognize Jim while he's here. Jim's been, I think, a well-known metro area expert with crisis intervention and has done a lot of training across the metro area. He's recently received a couple of awards. This will be in your next manager's update, but I want everybody to hear it this evening. I don't know if y'all knew, but August 29th was Jim Lorentz Day in the city of Denver. Denver Mayor Michael Hancock, he's probably embarrassed, declared that Jim Lorentz Day. Was there big sales that day or something?
I was hoping there would be a mattress sale and maybe free parking or something, but yeah.
I'm going to butcher this, so I'm not going to say this. Jim might be able to pronounce this, but it was in recognition of the Menorah Yusui Community Volunteer Award. The award was presented to Jim by the City and County of Denver, the Denver Foundation, Spark for Change, and the NYCVA Committee. It recognized Jim's work in training first responders and how to deal with community members suffering with dementia, which unfortunately is happening more and more. And then also, just recently, last weekend, I believe, or the weekend before, September 28th, Jim was also recognized again for his work with dementia patients. He received the National Alliance on Mental Health and Jefferson County Crisis Team Award for it was the first annual CIT Awards banquet. So congratulations, Jim, and
Thank you.
Thank you for representing the city so well on that.
Okay.
Thanks.
Well, congratulations, Jim. Any questions? Ms. Hoppy?
I don't have any questions. I just want to say thank you for bringing this. I do support this wholly. I will support it as a budget item if necessary at a later time. Unfortunately, the police department and our penal system ends up being our go-to mental health system, and that's not how it should be happening. And I know I worked with at-risk youth for a long time, and also part of our responsibility was to answer a crisis line. And there are very limited resources for people, and the police department is who ends up dealing with it. And so I really appreciate all the training that the staff is getting, and I appreciate having this grant. So thank you.
Thank you. Any additional questions? Mr. Urban?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My question is, and this may not have been discussed yet, but how does this program intersect with the homeless navigator or coordinator, and how will those two work together?
So really, really good question, and we're not really sure since we don't have our navigator yet. I know we're going to have a meeting with the new county navigator soon. It's all pretty much together, working together in that way. But I don't really have an answer for you right now as to how that will be. Might it be a sharing of resources or office space so that they can work together and exchange information here at the PD? I would certainly see that.
Okay. And then, as far as the persons that are being intake through this process, is that intake a result of interaction with law enforcement, or is it as a result of a neighbor or somebody showing concern about that individual? What's the pipeline coming in as far as?
So it's usually the calls that come through our dispatch, but we will respond as we normally do, and if we have a co-responder that happens to be working at that time, it won't be 24/7. There'll only be 2, but we've identified the peak hours as to when those encounters occur most often. so we'll have them riding at those times. They'll be able to deal with the situation right there on the spot when they're with us. But really, one of the great things, I think, is the follow-up that they do. So a lot of times people may not be ready for some kind of intervention at that time. If we can keep things static, and that co-responder can do follow-up the next day or call up and how are you doing, and here are our resources. Maybe tomorrow is a better time to hear what options are available. So that's really the best thing that I've seen. I've seen that in Longmont, some of that occurring with co-responders, and I think that's pretty exciting.
So if an individual is in need of this service and has allegedly committed a crime, how does that intersect the following day with that provider, and how does that relate to the doctor-patient privilege there?
So most of the time, the crimes that we're talking about are not major crimes. They could be disturbing the peace, they could be possession of alcohol, urination in public, all kinds of different minor crimes that can be dealt with through a mental health system if that's more appropriate. If we're talking about major crimes of assault or something greater, certainly that's a time that a person may be jailed. But we want to try to deal with those things that are more associated with mental health issues.
And my line of thinking on that is I just didn't want to get in a situation where this individual is counseling or consoling or otherwise engaging with this individual, and that somehow relates to a confession or some other admission by that person, and then how does that professional...
Yeah, but they're not police officers, so that it really doesn't apply. We're not using other people to obtain information. They're trying to help people, so it is a medical situation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Matthews?
Thank you, and I'd like to mention at this time and piggyback a little bit on Mr. Goff that for the last 4 years I've had extensive interaction with Division Chief Lorentz, and I think he's just a valuable asset to our city, and a quality person and a quality policeman. So I can't say enough good things about him. Being kind of right-brained, one of the questions I have is what kind of with just this limited co-responder resource, what kind of response times do we expect to have to get someone on site? And I'm assuming that this is in no way going to substitute any of the training for intervention that our patrol officers are already receiving.
Right. Yeah, we're still going to continue crisis intervention training so that our officers know how to recognize different types of mental illness or impairment of any kind. They know some resources to get, and mostly what they know are de-escalation techniques. So these are, we're there to handle a immediate problem, and some of these problems are going to take a long time to solve. So that's kind of where it goes into the realm of mental health professionals. If our officers are alone, they will handle the situation as they have in the past. If we can contact, if we have, like I said, if our co-responders happen to be in Golden, we can bring them over. There's no real immediacy once the police are there and we can make a situation static and safe. We'll hang on to that situation until we can get some help over. If we don't have a co-responder on, we can refer them for follow-up when they're on at the next point. So it'll always be relatively immediate.
Are there enough co-responders in the system that we can be covered 24/7?
No, and there's not. There aren't really funds to cover that either. So we can hire two, and these two responders are actually going to be hired by Jefferson Center. That money will be paid to Jefferson Center from the county to cover that. There's other funding and other grants that cover different pockets. Arvada has funding specifically from the city of Arvada to cover their program. Lakewood is running one. I'm not sure exactly how they're funding that. South Jeffco is funded by the county. So there's different ways of doing it. I think that's what we'll figure out, how will be best for us to do that within the next year. And you know, does it give us more bang for the buck? I'm sure it does. I can tell you that right now, but I'll give you the exact numbers, you know, in a few months.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Hoppy.
Sorry, I turned my page and had realized I had made myself a note of a question. What type of data, do you know what type of data you're going to be collecting and will be able to then report out later?
So it'll be all from our JeffCom Communication Center. It will come from them. What type of calls? We'll look for what type of calls we would have liked to have had a co-responder there. We'll know when co-responders were there, and some kind of effective rate, if we can figure that out, how much participation we get and how successful we think we've been. As I said, there's examples all around us, Arvada, South Jeffco, so I don't really know all of the systems and the way they're collecting it, but we're all in the same system now. That's the great thing. We all are on the same TriTech and niche reporting systems. We're using the same dispatch center, so it should be pretty easy.
Thank you. Chief Lorentz, on the grant that we were awarded, $125,000, and that's sort of for a one-year tour. And then I guess the hope would be that we could continue that funding. Is that sufficient funding in order to employ these two individuals for the program?
So that's what we're told now, and we'll have to see how that's divided up. In my own mind, I see two master's level behavioral health specialists, maybe more expensive than that. That's why I'm suggesting maybe more like 50,000 divided by 3 might be more realistic, but we know that we can do it for this year. We've already figured that out, so we'll see how it goes. And like I said, I'll keep you updated, and we should have a report for you in mid-spring, I would think, that would have enough data that we can draw some conclusions.
All right, any additional questions? Well, Division Chief, thank you so much for coming in. Looks like a great program, and congratulations on your awards, and thanks for being part of our fine PD department.
Thank you.
All right, appreciate it. Our next order of business is agenda item number 2, inclusive public hearings, People Speak online platform. Mr. Goff.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I will turn it over to Ken Johnstone. We have some guests and other staff, and I'll let Ken introduce them.
Mr. Johnstone.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. We're pleased to be here tonight to talk about a new topic that we haven't been in front of you before, but the potential to implement a new online public engagement process that we're pretty excited about, I think. And to that end, Lauren Mikulak, our planning manager, who most of you know is here, as well as our esteemed guest, Travis Parker, who's the planning director with Lakewood. So thank you for taking a Monday night. Your council's meeting tonight too? Just happened to not have an agenda item, and here you are. So thanks.
This
so
one's a
much
lot
for
more
being
fun,
here.
right? Okay, good. All right.
Yeah, we promise not to go to 2.
Yeah.
So again, we're here to talk about a potential new online public engagement platform that we think has the potential to really increase the public's ability to participate in hearings, public hearings before both the Planning Commission and City Council, specifically regarding the work of the Planning Division. So quasi-judicial land use cases and amendments to the Land Use Code, the Chapter 26 of the Zoning Code. In the past several years, we've certainly observed that the public feels like they want to have more opportunities to be meaningfully heard. We hear that and are trying to be responsive to that. We think in particular that desire to be heard relates a lot to what's being built around it and the growth and the change that they're experiencing in the city and the Denver metro region and in their neighborhoods. It's certainly, I think, appears to be a direct reaction to just the amount of growth and change that we're experiencing, again, in the metro area as well as in Wheat Ridge specifically. We certainly hear it at our local planning commission meetings, and I'm sure you all hear some of that sentiment at your city council meetings on Monday nights. It was also certainly a message that came out of the 2019 update to the neighborhood revitalization strategy. And as you know, we are embarking on a new neighborhood engagement program this year as well, which we think is a good parallel approach, but a different approach, and that will be more at a grassroots level and more free form, whereas this is really proposed to be specifically addressing the land use and legislative items related to the zoning code. Lauren and I recently had the pleasure of attending the state planning conference, and I must say that engagement was really a theme up there we as well, so we both attended some good training sessions in that regard. So what is current practice? Do you have the? Good. So our standard public notice, which has been...
Get the lights off, please.
He left.
Oh, did he leave? Oh, there we go. No.
I saw him leave. Our current practice is twofold. For a neighborhood meeting, which is a precursor to actually applying for a land use application, we do a 600-foot mailing. So people in a fairly broad swath, and that's about a block or two, depending on the lot and block configuration, get notice prior to an application being submitted. So before you even have the right to submit a land use application in Wheat Ridge, that neighborhood meeting is a requirement prior to that. For Planning Commission and City Council hearings, we have a 300-foot notice, so 300 feet from the perimeter of the subject property. Those people receive a notice, and we also physically post the property for notice of the hearing, as well as posting it in the transcript as our local newspaper. That's probably typical for most municipalities. I mean, there's nuances to all that, but we're certainly not, I'd say, out of the norm. But if our sense is that isn't passing muster, we are looking to explore ways that we might improve that noticing process. So what is people speak? Lauren and I, back about 6 months ago, I think it was April, Lauren and Stephanie, one of her staff, actually participated in a webinar, and it happened to feature Lakewood and his People Speak, or Lakewood Speaks platform, as a new platform, a new way to engage the public in an online kind of virtual public hearing process. Lauren encouraged me to look at that as well, which I did shortly thereafter. And the platform, in a nutshell, provides, again, a kind of a virtual way to participate in a planning commission or city council hearing. A person that would go to this dedicated portal would be able to see the presentation just as it would be presented, so see the facts of the case, and then have an opportunity to provide comments to staff, questions to staff, and more importantly, official kind of public hearing comments to the Planning Commission, and then separately to City Council in that incremental process. And those comments that would come in through that platform would become an official part of the public record, and we're going to dive into a little bit of the detail looking at some of the web page today, but if council is supportive of this, we'd obviously have separate training that really shows how you would interface with this portal. Lauren and I, after seeing Travis's presentation, and that was actually a national APA webinar, I think had the same reaction, which is it just seems like that's something we should explore and could be a really good fit for engaging the Wheat Ridge community. One of the drivers for our thinking that could be a really good process for us was some of the demographic data that Travis presented in terms of who they were seeing participating in this through this portal. And I'll turn it over to Travis to go over a couple slides in that regard.
Thanks, Ken. So we've been running this program for over 2.5 years now on our Planning Commission and more recently on our City Council. And we've been tracking a lot of data. We wanted to make sure that the program was meeting the needs that it was created for and adding to the public engagement of the City Council and the Planning Commission. This graph here shows by decade, the population of Lakewood over 25, so 25 to 35, 35 to 45, and so on. And you can see it's a fairly even distribution. This is the actual population demographics. All of these cohorts are within 1 or 2% of each other. Now, you've got a fairly young crowd here tonight, but over a period of about a year, we monitored our in-person public hearing attendance by age. And what we found was over 80% of our public hearing attendees were 55 or older. We weren't getting the attendance by the 25 to 55-year-old cohorts in our live public hearing. During that same time period, we measured the commenters on the Lakewood Speaks site, and the actual demographics on the site looked something like this. And much more closely matches the actual demographics of our population and more than adequately compensates for lack of participation for those 25 to 55-year-olds. We see those cohorts are all represented at or greater than their actual demographics in the city. The second thing we measure is when people comment. So public cases are up on our site for 10 days for City Council, for 2 weeks for Planning Commission. So people during that time period can go on any time, day or night, over that 10-day period to read the information and comment on a case. And what we find is there's a couple of common points when people actually are commenting. It's late morning around 11 o'clock, late afternoon around 4 o'clock, and late evening around 9 o'clock when people actually get on and engage with the site and leave their comments. Interestingly, over the entire period that these demographics were taken, which is about an 8-month period, we didn't receive one single comment for all of those cases between 6 p.m. and 8 p.m., which just happens to be when we hold our meetings. And so we're holding our meetings at literally the last time that people want to participate when they can choose their own time. And then finally, in terms of just numbers of participants, this is a snapshot of 8 recent cases that have been on the site, with the light green being in-person participation and the dark green being online participation in terms of number of comments. This is just a small snapshot, but it's fairly consistent over the entire life of this, is that we're seeing around 2 times as many online comments as we get in-person comments. And we don't have enough distance to tell whether what that trend will continue to do, but it appears to be going up. A few weeks ago, we had a case with 3 in-person comments and 34 online comments. So it seems to be an upward trend in terms of the number of comments we're getting in comparison to the number of in-person comments. And we not only measure commenters in person versus commenters online, but we also measure attendees in person versus people that come on and watch the presentations and watch the materials online. That number is even more significant. We're seeing about 10 times as many people watch the presentation online as show up and watch it in person. And that number has been relatively consistent over the last year or 2 as well. So I'll turn it back over to Lauren for the next stage.
Yeah, we know it's hard to sort of learn about a website without going on the website, so some of you may have gone onto lakewoodspeaks.org, but we included in the advanced packet some screenshots just so that you can become familiarized with what does this look like, and hopefully the takeaway is that this is a fairly intuitive interface. Kudos to Lakewood, who essentially designed the platform with a software company out of Boulder, but this is and they created a demo site for us, so that's why it says Wheat Ridge on here. It's not a real website quite yet, but it would be as simple as listing the upcoming agenda items. This is not legible, but that's not entirely the point. So we'd have a planning commission and we'd also have a city council, assuming both boards decide to use it. And there's colored icons, just a couple of them indicating if a comment period is open, if a case has been decided favorably or not, or if it's still pending. Those names of those agenda items are links that you would click, and then it's sort of a one-stop shop. I know this is really not legible, but the idea being that each agenda item just has 1 page, very simple. You have a short description at the top. You have a link to PDF vicinity map or even a Google map if we wanted to do that. And then we will load the staff presentation. There's an empty space here where you could upload an applicant's presentation should they choose to do that. Some do, some don't. There's space in the middle here where we would link our planning division staff report. We can list the criteria for review. As you all see, sometimes, we really want to explain to the public, we're looking at a subdivision, and here's what our considerations are. It's not density, it's not this. Just try to use this as an education tool as much as anything. And then at the bottom, one of these buttons is to subscribe for updates, so you can be notified if you were interested of whether it was approved, denied, continued, whatnot. And then you can submit your comments. Some of the things we wanted to share just about the commenting, again, this was in the staff report. The purpose here is not to create a new system, create a new framework. We're really trying to mimicking the system we already have. So the comment field, you don't need to create an account to comment. You simply enter your name, your address, and your comment. Your address is not publicly visible. It's only visible to decision makers. Same as at the podium, we ask for an address, but if you don't give it, you're not pressed for that. Comments are limited to 1,000 words. That's about the same as what you can read or say in 3 minutes, so that's like for like. One of the cool features, I think, I get asked, how can I participate? Well, you can either come in person, you can watch it online, or you can give me your comments, and that's really not. I can see people just deflate when I'm like, I don't want to give your comment. Like, my comment's not meant for me, right? It's meant for you. And while we do put them in the case file and we include them in the staff report, you've seen how many or how few written comments you get for cases. I think the beauty of this is it goes directly into the public record, and there's that little note at the bottom you saw in the screenshots that says 4 out of 8 council members have read this, 5 out of 8 council members have read this, right? So there's that sort of instant feedback that folks want to know that a decision maker has seen the comment. Couple of things in terms of what changes for us. We learned about this now several months ago. We talked to Travis, we talked to Mr. Dahl, we talked to our staff, we've all watched the webinar, we had lunch, we tried to sort of look at this from every possible angle, and frankly, it really doesn't change a whole lot of our current practice, because the goal is not to change it, but to mimic it. So we already prepare a presentation, we already prepare a staff report, we already post those things to the web. We're doing it a couple days earlier, in some cases I think a week earlier for our slides. We're tweaking a letter that we already send to direct people to this website instead of to our staff. We're tweaking a sign that we already post to direct people to this website instead of our staff. So it's really just streamlining processes that we're already doing to get the information to the audience we wanted to attract in the first place. For you all, the change would be that you would be reviewing online comments in advance of the meeting. You could start reviewing those as soon as they're open. We would recommend that the cutoff time for comments be the Sunday before your Monday meeting. Those times can be set at your leisure. We recommended a few more days for our planning commission because they have a weekday meeting and might need a little bit more time to review the comments. The website works on a phone, a tablet, or a desktop, so the lift on reading the comments is not a whole lot more than sort of scrolling through the news feed that you may already be doing on sort of your app of choice. We've talked a lot about 3 minutes. Listening to somebody for 3 minutes is actually a lot more time than reading 1,000 words. So while it is an additional request in terms of preparation for the meeting, it's a different amount of time for you to read a comment versus to listen 30 more people at a public hearing. The other notable change that hopefully makes your lives easier is giving folks, if you have comments or questions or the notorious get accosted in the vegetable aisle example, you can just tell them go to wheatridgespeaks.org. It's not a website yet, but it would be that simple. So it's a receptacle for any desirable ex parte contact. I get comments sometimes from people who say, well, I've emailed my planning commissioner about this zone change. Why didn't they write me back? Like it's an ongoing sort of education. Let's see, things that this wouldn't do. We've covered some of this. So again, we're trying to mimic our current practice and provide an additional opportunity for contact. I can't reiterate this enough. It wouldn't change any of the current practice as you already experience it. So we'll still publish in the paper, we'll still mail a letter, we'll still post a sign, we'll still do an in-person public hearing, we'll still do an in-person presentation, and we'll still take in-person testimony. It's just an additional opportunity for folks to be engaged if they want to. We had the question, we presented this to Planning Commission last Thursday, and they had a good question of like, what if nobody comments? Is it worth it? And Travis just showed the data that views are, in my mind, an as valuable metric to know people are paying attention. And it's really important to us, especially in light of the comments and feedback we've heard in the last year, that you may not want to comment, but I want to make sure you have an opportunity to comment. And it just feels like we need to have a very, very sort of historical, perhaps outdated system have a fresh look. So Lakewood's been using the platform, I think, as y'all said, for about 2 years with the Planning Commission. And we asked Travis to share some feedback to sort of the anticipated frequently asked questions maybe that we're getting.
So I should preface this by saying, in the 2.5 years that we're using this, we haven't had one significant negative feedback from any source, right? I think a month or so ago, I got a comment from a city council member. The most negative thing I've heard yet is, I just logged on to Lakewood Speaks and there's no comments there. And I said, well, even with online participation, some cases aren't going to have comments. But in general, our decision makers have loved it. They've expressed, appreciation for reaching new audiences, for getting additional feedback. They appreciate the opportunity to, read a significant number of the comments on their own time, right, without extending the public hearing, the length of the public hearings. They also really appreciate getting a chance to understand a lot of the public's concerns and issues prior to the night of the hearing, so that they're not blindsided by new issues on the night that they have to make a decision. They're getting stuff days or maybe a week ahead of time and having a chance to think that over. And then finally, like Lauren mentioned, for quasi-judicial cases, an opportunity to respond to people with an actual opportunity to participate, saying, I can't talk with this case about you, but you can put your comments here for the entire council. In terms of citizens, we do, hear appreciation for the additional opportunity to participate, the opportunity to participate without attending the hearing, the additional opportunity to locate all the information about a case in one place, watching presentations, reading staff reports and asking questions all on the same site. And then we haven't heard any issues in terms of ease of use. It's a pretty intuitive site and easy for both decision makers and citizens to use. And in terms of staff, our planning staff designed it. So we designed it around our needs, and it is very simple for us to create a case. It takes a couple minutes for us to put the information in and create a new case. And we appreciate the fact that it saves us a lot of time in answering questions when all the information is already available, right? People don't have to call us and ask us to send them the staff report or ask questions about the case when it's now much easier to just go on and find that information and they know where to look for it.
Travis, would you mind speaking a little bit to how you monitor content and your experiences with that?
Certainly. So when a member of the public inputs a proposed public comment on there, it doesn't immediately populate on the site. What it does is the system sends an email back saying, thank you for your comment. I forget the exact language, but when the comment is moderated, it will appear on the site. The system sends an email to the staff planner, whoever is responsible for that case, and says a comment has been submitted on this case, lists the comment, and do you approve or reject this comment? The only reasons for rejection are in the comment policy, so profanity, personal attacks, things like this. We've never had to approve or to reject a comment for any of those reasons. The only comments we've ever rejected have been accidental duplicate submissions, where somebody accidentally submitted the same comment twice. But if you did have to, if a staff person did have to, they could hit reject on their app, and it drops down a list of reasons. So rejected for profanity, for example. When the staff or person approves or rejects, the system automatically sends an email back to the commenter saying your comment has been posted, or if it's rejected, it says your comment has been rejected for this reason, please resubmit. And so it offers them the opportunity to do it again. Again, we've never had the cause to actually use that reject button for any real reason. So it's pretty simple for the staff planners. It's a really quick turnaround, and the commenters are notified. They're thanked for their comment, and they're notified when it's on the site.
So what next? We are looking for discussion and consensus if you're so inclined to move forward with this. We did take this, as Lauren mentioned, to the Planning Commission last week, and they approved a motion to move forward with it to City Council. We have budgeted for it in the proposed 2020 budget. It's a monthly fee. If we're not happy with it for any reason, there's no long-term contracts. Thanks, Travis, for negotiating those terms. And people speak, it's a company out of Boulder, so I mean that's nice and convenient in terms of tweaking should that be necessary. There's a close contact. It ends up being about $1,600 a month. It's based on population, so a little less than $20,000 a year. And we need to buy a microphone, apparently. I'm not sure. We budgeted for those two, but I don't think they're terribly expensive. If there is consensus and the budget gets approved, we'd propose to kind of do the legwork over the next several months and then work on training for the Planning Commission and City Council so you'd know how to access this tool and look at these comments. So implementation for, again, just land use cases and zoning code amendments and implement very early in 2020.
Well, I think there'll be plenty of people here that want to comment on this item. So let's start with Mr. Pond.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Thank you for being here tonight. I support it. And I'm just going to ask a couple of questions that I think that hit me. One of the things that I like most about it is how intentional it is to try to track the public input process. To make sure that it's truly a public hearing and it's meeting all those requirements. The couple of things that I've heard that make me pause for a second to understand how that's happening. Two things. One, questions of staff. When we have people at the podium asking questions of staff in a public hearing, we don't often stop to answer those questions. They either will get called out by a council member during the dialogue, and the council member would direct the staff to answer a question that was posed 30 minutes ago or something like that. Sometimes some of those questions may not get answered, and so I'm curious about that because I think that it could create essentially a dialogue within the public comment, right? In other words, someone who posts something has a question, perhaps it's responded to by staff if that's the way it works, and then other commenters potentially can see that in the string of things. If that's not the way it is, then
that's not. So the ask staff question is actually replicating the back and forth that usually happens on email prior to cases, and none of that is public. That's a personal between them.
Excellent. That answers that question.
And the benefit of that is that those questions aren't lost in any individual staff person's email, but rather all of our division can see it. So somebody's on vacation, and it's mimicking not the public comment, but that
I like that. And then the second piece, and I'm sure you have a good answer for this as well, would be that it sounds like you're putting up a presentation that you have to pretty much stay on script with when you show up in the room for the actual public hearing. And I would imagine there's some temptation, or could be some temptation, if you get a bunch of questions while you posted this thing, to somehow change your script when you come up here on Monday night because because people didn't understand it perhaps when you videotaped it. But I would assume that you can't do that. It has to be word for word, slide for slide, exactly what was on the website.
Yes. So our intent, based on talking to Travis, is to have the same presentation. What we will do, and what we already do, is say, during the public comment period leading up to this presentation, we've received X additional phone calls, comment, whatever. We already should be summarizing for you some of the comment we would have heard since the packet went out. Any themes that are coming out on this platform would be rolled into that one update. So that'd be the only difference between the previous and the live.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll just go around the table. Ms. Hoppy.
Actually, as I walked in the room today, I said to Councilmember Urban, "Ooh, I'm so excited about this. Wheat Ridge Speaks." I'm super excited about it. I appreciate Councilmember Pond's questions. which gave me some answers. And then my only other thing is that we had said in the what next, we're proposing to utilize it only for planning division and community development for land use cases and amendments to zone code. Is there any thought of using it for anything more in the future once this kind of starts rolling?
That's certainly a possibility. We embarked on this as a department, and we're sensitive to not just kind of saying to the other department heads, you're going to be doing this. We think it has a specific need for us just because we've experienced some of this interest and pressure and engagement desires relative to land use cases specifically and development. But yes, it's certainly a tool that could be expanded, and in fact, as I understand it, Lakewood has expanded it as well.
Great, thank you, and thank you for your time this evening. Thanks, you guys.
Thank you. Mr. Urban.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you all for the presentation. I really appreciate encouraging and finding ways to engage citizens and get them more involved. As it relates to the decision maker reviewing the comments and the system being able to see who has read them and who has not, is there a process in place if a council member has not reviewed those comments? Does that council member then have to review that before the hearing can start, or what happens when a council member doesn't participate in that process as much as they should?
And Travis may have comments on this too, but we've certainly looked at that comment relative to the legal aspects of whether that would be somehow a fatal flaw in the use of the online. And Jerry is behind me, and I think the answer is we don't think that that's the case. With all due respect to council, you could be spacing out up there and not hearing someone speaking as well. So that's your prerogative as people making these decisions. So we would certainly hope, and I know Travis has done some assisting with council members to help them go through the portal, so that we're glad to do that if that helps you do that. But no, we don't think that would that's problematic per se.
Mr. Dahl, if you'd like to speak, would you come to the podium?
The point Ken makes is a good one, which is that it's a matter of paying attention, and council members it is hoped that you pay attention to every single word that's ever said. But
What is that?
But we get it that's another form of communication that maybe you hear, maybe you don't. You do your best. I know you all do your best, and that's really all that's required. And I don't think that this system sets you up, really, which I think is in part your question of how I might react were I a council member, does not set you up for some challenge for dereliction of duty or some defect in the hearing process, because it's the record that's available to you. It's available to the whole council. Maybe they heard all of it or didn't, or read all of it or didn't. But in terms of the enforceability of your decision once you have made it, I'm really comfortable with that.
Well, but I think in this circumstance, that if someone is speaking up here, there's a videotape of the two people in the room, and you can make the argument the person's not paying attention. But in this instance, you can clearly show that the council member didn't even log into the system and had no chance of not paying attention. In this situation, you have that chance of not paying attention, but you still have that record that this person spoke with an earshot of this person. Mm-hmm. But in this circumstance, you can clearly show they never even logged in or looked at it. So that evidence you can tell that wasn't even considered. Whereas here, that there might be some wiggle room. So I would just want us to do something to say that at the beginning of the hearing, all council members have logged in, or the city clerk saying 3 out of the 3 council members have viewed it and the others have not, or what have you. But to leave that kind of open concerns me.
I'd be curious if that came up, Travis. Let me, while he's thinking about that answer, I'd be all right with a couple of things. One would be that it becomes a council rule that this is part of your obligation. You've got council rules that express your obligation, and we kind of rely on that to address the concern you're raising, and or adding that some kind of record, probably as a part of the staff report, the Wheatridge Speaks information was made available to all council members per their council rule. I think the place I wouldn't go would be kind of memorializing in the hearing, okay, 5 of 8 have reviewed this, because that's a record that kind of lends itself to a challenge, and that may or may not be true, but that's sort of true already, and kind of making a record around that makes me a little uncomfortable, and I don't think you have to. If you've got a rule that says we will do our best and memorialize in our council rules, I think that's pretty good. I see where you're headed. Travis, have you had any experience with that?
And let me start, before I answer that, let me start by saying the system makes it really easy for you. There are a couple things that happen. When the comment period closes, it will send each of you an email to say the comment period is closed and there are X number of comments, and you just click a button to go there. And then at a time set by staff, for us it's noon the day of the hearing, it sends another email to any council members that have not yet. So the ones that have read it don't get another email, but any that haven't yet, they get a second email saying you still have unread comments, click here. So that takes care of 90% of the issue right there. With our planning commission, we have never had we've had 7 of 7 at every single, not a problem. With our council, we've had a little more adoption. There are a couple council members that I personally go and talk to before each hearing to keep them on. And we've had a couple hearings where we were 9 or 10 out of 11, just a couple times. But it hasn't been a problem really, generally, for people to just log on and look at the comments. And even on those couple instances where we had 9 or 10, no one really called attention to that. I mean, the majority of council had looked at those comments, and it wasn't an issue.
And then my next question.
Okay, go ahead.
As it relates to individual cases that may come up in our city, we have the Google Maps that have a list of the current applications that are out there, but within the system, is there any mechanism for a resident to go in and say, I want to know about any development within a half-mile radius of this particular property, or any notification process built in? Or
That's interesting that you ask, because it's something we're working on. So first, what the system does now is when there's a case up, it allows them to subscribe for notifications about that case. So if you open case X, you can subscribe for notifications, so when it's approved or denied, they get an email that says the case was approved or denied, that sort of thing. In terms of general notification, we've had a lot of discussions with People Speak about that. It's on their list of things to design, is an opportunity to sign for general notifications, either notifications about a certain type of case, like send me notifications whenever there's a new rezoning or something like that, or notifications within a certain geographic area. So that's something that they haven't designed yet, but will be part of a future iteration of this.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I'll go to Mr. Matthews.
Thank you, and I'd like to applaud staff for taking the step to bring this forward. It's been one of my passions for 4 years, is to increase our participation and get notice out to folks of what's going on in their neighborhoods. I got several comments here, and I've kind of made them as I went down through that, so they may be a little disjointed. And there were a couple of new issues that came up tonight. And the one issue I thought about when you mentioned rejecting comments because of profanity, I'd have to direct this to Mr. Dahl, because I believe we were briefed here a few months back about people coming up to the podium and using profanity and what have you, and outrageous behavior, trying to get us to kick them out so they could say we had infringed on their First Amendment rights. So that's one of my questions that just came up now is, how do we avoid that catch-22?
Well, fair enough. I think to begin with, you encourage good behavior, and 99 times out of 100, that's what you get. What I would want to do, I think, is have a little bit more of a review loop on rejected comments, since they are so seldom. That's something that I'd like to be able, and I've given this some thought, and I'd like to be able to have the opportunity for those to be vetted by me or someone in my office for that purpose. And, that's going to be very rare, so I don't know, as we've heard. But I think one distinction we can make is the city creating a record and effectively publishing that information. I think we've got a little more latitude there, and it's something I'd like to do a little research on. A little more latitude there to saying, look, lots of stuff gets set up here. We all know there are people that are in the business of provoking councils, and people kind of making the rounds around the state doing that. And my advice to the mayor has consistently been, you put up with that because you do. But I think you can make a little bit of a distinction where you're publishing that effectively because you're making a record of that. Now that's a public record at the city, and I think we have the ability to look at obscenity. We also have the ability to look at comments that might be seen as harassing or bullying of other people. And I think that the city then would have, because it's not that, and I'll shut up in a minute, it's not that the First Amendment says you can say anything, anytime, all the time, there are no restrictions. You can have content restrictions on speech if there's a compelling governmental interest in doing that. And if the compelling governmental interest is to protect someone from bullying or harassment, I think that's pretty good. I'm comforted that it so seldom comes up that once every few months at most that I'm asked that question, I can parse through it and help. I'm glad you asked the question. I think it's a real serious one. I also am happy to hear that it's going to be so rare that it's going to be no more than the occasional questions I get around that coming from other directions.
Mr. Matthews?
Thank you, Mr. Dahl. And I've got I totally support this initiative, don't get me wrong, so I just have nuts and bolts questions. One of my comments would be that we need to increase or institute this measure along with maybe some other changes. As of, for instance, I've never believed that 300 feet was sufficient notice from the property. And one of my questions was this then is, how do we get that notice out to the general populace? And is it going to be more than 300 feet, or is it going to be just a general notice online that this property has got this much going on and anybody from any part of the city can comment on it? So that would be one of my comments there is that how do we, is this going to be limited, or can people from across the whole city know that it's going on, and how do they get that information?
So the notice that, I think Lauren alluded to this, the notice that we mailed, that 300-foot distance would include a link to this online opportunity for comment, in addition to the notice of the public meeting. So that's one. There's no geographic limitations on who can comment, so if you get to that information and want to make a comment, it's certainly not limited by any geographic boundaries.
So the notice would be open for our whole population to read?
Well, the notice still gets published, mailed directly to the people within 300 feet.
Right.
The notice also gets posted on the property. So if you were driving by and saw it, we're talking about other ways to get the community, make the community aware of this opportunity in general. And then it would just be incumbent upon them to, check in periodically or do whatever they feel appropriate to stay engaged in that. But then, regardless again of geographic boundaries, they could certainly comment on any case.
Yeah. I mean, so that would be one of my comments, is that we need to make sure that more than just 300 feet each side of the property are aware that this is actually going on. One complaint that I've had is that the developer gets unlimited time. And now we're talking about generally for a period of 3 minutes for public comment, but on agenda items, we don't limit them to three minutes. And so why are we limiting them to 1,000 words as a response?
So at Planning Commission, we do limit comments to 3 minutes, and we make that a very clear rule at the very beginning of the meeting, and it's consistent for all of our public hearings, in part for efficiency and in part because I think over time we've just learned in that setting in particular, there's not a lot of new stuff to say after 3 minutes, and the most effective comments have been those that have been more concise. I know you have the discretion to limit comments for public hearings. It's not a rule. It's not a hard and fast rule in the bylaws of the Planning Commission either. But in an effort to make the online and the live experience mimic each other to the greatest extent possible, it's probably something we'd want to explore in terms of mimicking that limit in the in-person hearing if it's not already being done consistently.
Okay, well, I'm not sure, are they still going to have a right to public comment at the hearing?
Yes.
So they can go in and then
Yes, in the same way that somebody can send me a written
opine for several minutes?
Right, so right now, somebody who feels strongly will send me a written comment, they'll do a phone call, they'll do a walk-on, and they'll come and talk in person. So we're not limiting anybody. If you've commented online, they're welcome to comment again in person.
Thank you. One other issue I'd like to have us kick around someday, in addition to this particular initiative, is you don't know what you don't know. And a lot of times, we have people come up and speak, and then the developer or whomever comes up and does an hour presentation, and people say, gee, I wish I'd known that before I got up to speak, because I'd have asked these 3 questions. And so we need to, I think, assist in getting that kind of information out and not limiting people to being able to respond to what the developer or whomever has said. Let me just find my next set of notes here. The other, and so that was kind of, like I said, a nuts and bolts type of things, because I think we need to help just expand that as much as possible. Are we accounting for other costs that may be associated with this? For instance, is whoever manages our website, and our IT guys, do they have sufficient time budgeted to handle getting this on the website and maintaining it and getting us our notices? And
so I manage most of the planning division website right now, or our admin. So we've been doing it now, and we'll keep that in our division.
okay, and then one last comment, with all due respect to Councilman Urban, because I share his concerns, but I remember when they used to just get envelopes with the agenda, and you would see people come up here and just, as they sat down in their chair, open the envelope. They didn't do any pre-work or pre-knowledge. And I know I, for myself, have gotten off a plane from Palau that I was supposed to be in at midnight, and I got in at 5 in the morning. And with naps, I'm not sure I did a thorough job of researching the agenda for Monday night. But I think we need to be a little careful about regulating council behavior. I think that's up to the people to observe who's paying attention and who's not, and vote them in or vote them out of office. I'm not sure we need rules towards that particular deal, that a councilman has to spend so much time or whatever reviewing an individual agenda or case. I mean, what are we going to do if he's not signed in? Are we going to somehow censor the councilor? I'm not sure that's a can of worms I'd like to open. But I do share the same concern that not always is there enough effort put in. In the past, I've seen it. But in general, I think we have a pretty good council, and I would not say that anyone's shirking their duties, so don't take it that way. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Davis?
So a lot of my questions were answered, but a couple clarifications. So I know you said that we'll put the slides on, et cetera, et cetera. Do you put the actual presentation on, or just the slides?
So PowerPoint has the ability to allow you to record audio with each slide, which is great because you don't have to then record 15 minutes in one big chunk.
Good.
It will have the audio and the slides.
All right, that's good, because I know adult learners do different things, and I'm a listener, adult learner, not a reader. So that was one of my questions. Another one of my questions was, I am thankful to hear that there is a little reminder that, hey, you've got the public hearings and we've got 5 comments for you to review. Because it is nice to have that reminder, because sometimes you have none, and so it's nice to have that reminder. So I'm glad to hear that too. One of the things that I want to talk about a little bit is kind of what was said earlier, or ask some questions about what was said earlier about the folks' names. So you said that they have to put in their names, and I'm guessing an email, because they'd get the email that, hey, we got your response, but they don't have to necessarily put in an address or anything like that. I guess I just worry, because sometimes I hear, you get the comments of, which just doesn't make it right or wrong, but you hear it, oh, well, they aren't even Wheat Ridge residents, or they bust people in for these comments and this activity. It's kind of all a ruse kind of thing. So how does Lakewood, or how do you handle that? Because I think sometimes you always get the naysayers that try to poke holes in any comments if they don't like them.
So we do require a physical,
Okay.
in person, we require a name and a physical address. So online, we try to mimic that. We require a name, a physical address, and then, like you said, an email address, so we can give them a receipt. On the public side, only the name shows up.
Okay.
So people see the comment and the name. Decision makers, however, see both. You will see a comment, a name, and an address
Okay.
when you log on.
Okay.
One more thing too, if I may. We talked about that at length with Planning Commission. And, we can accept testimony from anybody. And we talked to Planning Commission about, it's your duty as a decision maker to weigh that evidence, right? So you can weigh the neighbor and their address evidence more in your mind, if you'd like, than somebody who enters an address of Timbuktu or wherever it may be. So our goal is to increase opportunity to participate and not to limit that. And then your duty is to sort of decide how you want to weigh who decides to participate.
Okay. Thank you. I think everyone else had already asked my questions. So I think that's it. Thank you.
Miss. I'm drawing a blank. 5 fridges. It's your turn to speak.
Right. Thank you.
Amanda Weaver, I'm sorry. It's a senior moment.
First of all, I really support this, and I'm so excited. And I just wanted to mention a few things. First of all, I've been teaching online for the last 10 years, and along with teaching online and in-person classes at the university, we have a content management system that's very, very similar. And of course, there was a lot of just stress because there was a perception that it would be more work and all of these different things. And I can't say enough on how much better organization everyone has, both participants, in my case, students, but also on the handling everything from emails to comments to seeing when people have been online, and these are just fantastic systems. So I can't say enough about that. And what we found at the university is the same thing that you all have found, is that you just reach more people and you reach a more diverse group. We have the opposite, where we have the younger people involved in the in-person meetings, but we get a much broader group of all age segments when we offer classes with these kinds of content management. And I have to say, the cost is amazing. You're not going to find anything like this, obviously, since it's just being created. But yeah, that's fantastic. I don't even think we should. Thank you for figuring it into the budget, because that's great. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Keeter.
So I also adore this idea, and again, from the start have been kind of looking for ways to engage people. One question I have: you said that people won't need an account to, and I think I understand what the rationale behind that would be. But is there any process to prevent somebody from, essentially Twitter botting and doing multiple comments under assumed names, or somebody doing a comment under somebody else's name and essentially kind of misrepresenting their identity?
Yeah, we talked about that a little bit at Planning Commission as well. So one of the criteria, harder to prove, in the moderation policy is false identification of the commenter. So if we felt like we were being trolled by the same person 20 ways with the same comment, then we could probably get there. And my response to Planning Commission is that Lakewood hasn't seen that happen, and I'd like to assume best intent and figure that problem out if we get there. I don't know if you've talked about it at all.
No, that's exactly, yeah, we spent a lot of time discussing this as we were creating this, and the spectrum is, we could require IDs and passwords and everything else, all the way to the completely open. We opted to go completely open, low barrier to entry, to try and welcome people in, and then if a problem occurs, we can beef up the security from there, and so far we haven't seen it.
It does have the recapture, I'm not a robot checkbox, so there is at least that.
Okay, so no robots can get through.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, and it seems that if, do you get any bounce backs on the confirmation email? Because that at least seems like a method where if you were getting, returns on emails that may be fake, that at least gives another step that you could go through to verify whether the comment was legitimate.
That's great. The receipt emails are automated, so I don't even know where the bounce back would go. We could ask people speak if they're getting, yeah. That's a good question.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I had some questions too. Mine were more technical. When does the public hearing open? Does the public hearing open when these comments, when this thing goes live online, or does it open when I open the public hearing when everybody's here?
I'll tell you, I think it opens when you open the public hearing, and what the system here facilitates the kinds of comments that now come in to the staff by phone, by email, by people walking in, and the staff trying to record that and providing it to you.
So the public hearing would open, and then these comments would be incorporated into the public hearing and part of the public record.
Yeah, that's my concept. I'm not sure kind of when Lakewood stitches it in.
Okay, is that?
That's where I think you stitch it in.
My implementation notes suggest that we modify our initial comments when staff says, I'd like to now enter into the public record the contents of the case file, the digital presentation, comments from wouldnt and so on and so forth.
Okay.
Well, I mean, this is new technology, so I think we're figuring it out as we go. In Lakewood, we've looked at it from the perspective of we now have a 2-week public hearing. So the public hearing starts when the website's up, and the whole thing is the public hearing. That's how Tim and I have discussed it. Our city attorney and I have discussed it.
Okay, thank you. Then there was another one I looked at the public hearing. There's a feature in here that I saw on the sort of the second page of the demo one, that it looked like that, and I don't think we do this now, is to give sort of the criteria by which projects are judged. And that there are some cases when we do that, you're judging this in accordance with this document and that document and that document. Is there more rigidity in that process now? Are you going to lay out that this is the criteria by which the council will judge these projects, when we have not historically done that?
Right, so right now, the decision-making criteria is pretty well buried in the middle of a often 30-page planning division staff report, and then sort of bifurcated by our analysis. We don't have to enter the decision-making criteria in this. It's an option that we'll weigh. We'll do it consistently one way or the other, but in my mind, for someone who's not going to open the staff report or watch the presentation and wants to make a comment for a subdivision case, and they're going to comment on the use or the density or something that just doesn't feel like it could be as productive, I want to use, and we're going to have the microphone a lot over the next couple of years with our sub-area plan and our engagement tour and something like this. Every opportunity we have to allow somebody to participate, but also to learn a little bit more or take away or feel like, oh, if I'd known that's what you were going to think about, I would have made my comment more salient. So to the extent we can keep that succinct but helpful and helping guide people to understand what are they commenting on, I'd like to use that so that it's not buried where it currently is in the middle of a staff report.
Thank you. Mr. Pond?
Well, I know the criteria is in the staff report often, and again, it's usually kind of dense in there, and then there's some other things. So I do appreciate the reasoning for pulling that out, although I will kind of perhaps echo the concern or go back to what I said before, how to make sure that we're being consistent in both cases. If we're pulling something out that was already there and we're highlighting it a little bit, I think that's probably okay. I didn't mention it before, but like the summary and the map that are on here, that we're not necessarily doing that in the public hearing, and perhaps if we are, again, if it's a pullout of something that should already be in the content that's either distributed in an analog format or up here, then I'm okay with that. If we're providing things in here that otherwise wouldn't show up, then that's where I think you start to get into concern.
It's mimicking two things, if I may respond. So we have a vicinity map buried, usually our first or second slide in a presentation, sometimes included in the mailer. I don't know if you've ever also received a mailer for a public hearing. You're going to hear it'll have a brief description. We've tried to make those more understandable. Sometimes with an image, if that does a better job of communicating what the request is. And often some combination of this information is what we're providing to somebody when they get the mailer and call and say, what the heck is this trying to say? Or what are they really going to be talking about? So it's all information we're giving in these various different outlets in that 2-week period in advance. So I don't think it's inconsistent. I think it's mimicking both that public noticing period and the public hearing. And in my mind, as long as we're doing that for each of our items on this platform, then I'd feel comfortable with it personally.
Thank you. I'm not quite done yet, so I got a few more items. There was another portion of the website that allowed a respondent in the public to sort of download additional documents. And I was wondering whether that had caused you in Lakewood, all of a sudden I've got not just 1,000 words, but I've got, a 382-page report here, and then I've got another 42-page report, and I've got, the documents, now in the public record are sort of endless, in a way.
I think you're referring to the public comment form where in this sort of demo version, it has the option to attach things.
Right.
I think in our staff discussions, we were inclined to disengage that feature.
Oh, okay. Well, that's an
we'll
easy
take
one.
your lead on that and maybe give some input.
Another issue that we thought, well, let's see how it goes. And we've had a couple people submit additional attachments. Usually they'll have a comment and they'll say, and I'm attaching a picture about what I'm talking about. It is obviously a way around the 1,000-word limit if someone wants to submit a book report along with their comment. But, if someone came here live, they could bring a 20-page manifesto and drop it off right with the clerk and hope that you read it. And so we haven't had too many attachments, a couple.
Okay.
They can still email stuff to us. I imagine some people will be in the habit of still sending us comments. So if somebody wants to get something in the record, not having that option wouldn't preclude them from doing so.
Right. The other thing I wanted to sort of revisit is whether you can sort of comment online and then comment in person. And I mean, it's sort of like, does that give one side an advantage against another? Are you still weighting the comments that you're receiving? Have you thought about that?
I have. It happens now. In a recent zone change this year, we had a written comment from a neighbor, and they commented at the podium. So it doesn't happen frequently. I don't think it would happen with all 30 people that comment online, but it's already happening. If somebody wants to submit a written comment, and they may also come to the podium, I think that's okay.
Okay. And I think my last one is, why wouldn't these public comments close on Thursday when the package is presented and is printed and presented for council?
I mean, our goal is to provide increased opportunity, so we can close the comment period at whatever time you think is reasonable to strike the balance between allowing the opportunity to comment and allowing you the time to review. The volume of comments you'll be reviewing is far less than the pages you read in your agenda packet, so we're open to that suggestion. We asked Lakewood sort of when they set their closing comments. I think we threw out noon on Sunday, but that is at your discretion.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Urban.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So in the situation where you have John Doe and John Doe Jr. at the same address and they both submit comments, how do we differentiate between someone submitting 2,000 words and two different people with the same name submitting 1,000 words each? Or is that?
You mean two people in the same address, can they each submit a comment?
Correct.
Yes. So we talked about that a little bit at Planning Commission, in the same spirit of how do you keep someone from trolling? Can you limit the IP address? I'd rather not do that, if there's a husband and a wife or a parent and a child and they all want to comment, that's the whole point of this in my mind.
And then, sorry, two more things. Not being able to navigate through the website, there was a link for a map. And so does that pull up a Google map of that location, or is it a static screenshot of that Google map? Or one of my concerns is if that image is refreshed halfway through and people are looking at two different sort of aerial views, how do we limit that?
So my draft plan is that the vicinity map link will link to the PDF that is essentially the excerpt of that, usually Exhibit 1. That's an aerial, our aerial with our outline. And that location map is a dynamic link to a non-aerialed Google map, so you just sort of get the context of where in the city we are. So you'd have two options.
Okay, good. And then my last question, in the council rules, we talk about written comments requiring a signature. And so in that regard, would the submit button be that electronic signature, or how do we do we amend the council rules relative to that signature, or how do we take that into consideration?
I don't know the council rules on
We need to work that, well, we'd have to work that out.
Yeah, I think pretty easily, though. Yeah, I think all you have to do is declare in the council rules that a submission through Wheat Ridge Speaks, when properly submitted and published, equates to a signed written comment, and we'd handle it that way.
Thank you.
Yep.
Ms. Hoppy, and let's sort of keep it to one question, and then maybe if you have a follow-up, then we'll do that, but not,
Oh, I was going to try to close it up with a consensus.
I think Mr. Matthews had another issue.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really concerned about setting this 1,000 word limit. That's would be one of my concerns when it comes to a final vote. And also, I'm also concerned about not being able to attach something. One of the problems we have is people complain that the developers got a PowerPoint presentation and staff assists him in how to prepare that and getting it on the computer and all that, and then they've got their 3 minutes or their time to come forward and we have to fumble, and they don't know how to or how our systems work, and maybe they could call us 4 days in advance, and I'm sure staff would be able to clue them in. But I think it's an excellent way if they want to provide some kind of a, like when we were working on bulk plane and they wanted to show their ideas of what bulk plane was, it's an excellent way for them to get their imagery in the record without having to come up here and then we have to suspend the meeting, so to speak, for 3 minutes or 5 minutes while we fumble around trying to get a thumb drive in and show them how the computer works and all that. So I'm not necessarily sure that that's not a bad thing to allow them to attach something in their comments. Thank you.
Ms. Hoppy?
If you're doing a consent, Mr. Mayor, I have a couple of questions, if I could, before she does a consensus.
What would that be?
Pardon me?
What is it?
Oh, I wanted to ask the gentleman from Lakewood, the clerk's office, we get bombarded with offers from all kinds of software companies for every kind of product you can think of. Are there any other companies that do this, or how did you go about choosing this particular program?
There aren't. So when we set out to find this in 2016, we assumed that there were other companies doing this. As of then, it didn't exist, and we haven't seen it since. There are online town hall companies, like companies where if you have a big comprehensive plan, you can get lots of comment around a big plan, but there isn't anybody mimicking online public hearings or mimicking public hearings online. So that's why we had to go find a company to help build it for us. And so we worked with them, we designed it, they built it, and we became their first customer.
Okay, good. Thank you. And then I had a question for Lauren. As far as public record, will there be some kind of hard copy document that we can file for the record?
Yes, so we will export all the comments and keep that in the case file if you need that. a copy of that for your files as well, we could do that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Hoppy.
Thank you. I'd like to ask for consensus to direct staff to move forward to develop the implement schedule and to contact council members to schedule training on the platform and to also keep the attachments option engaged and to change the deadline to midnight Saturday before the meeting.
We have consensus on that, so move forward. Thank you very much. Good presentation. Looks like a really great program. And do you have a timing on when this might roll out?
I knew that question would come. We're shooting for as early in 2020 as we can. We'll look at our pipeline of cases so that it's not a surprise to an applicant in the queue, but sooner the better.
Terrific. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yes, we're gonna stand for about a 10-minute recess. We'll be back at 8:20. Okay, thank you very much. We'll reconvene our meeting and go to agenda item number 3. This is the 2018 Building Code Adoption Update. Mr. Goff.
Thank you. Mr. Johnstone is here again, and staff, and I'll let him introduce.
Yeah, so thanks for having us here to talk more about the building codes. Randy Slesser, our chief building official with Charles Abbott Associates, is here as well as our technical resource, but I'm going to kind of kick it off. We're here to talk about adoption of the 2018 International Codes, or International Building Codes. They're actually called just the International Codes, but we all know them as our building codes. We're currently operating on the 2012 codes, and so proposing to go to the 2018. The International Code Council adopts new codes every 3 years. They're on a 3-year cycle, but we and many other jurisdictions are often on a 6-year cycle, just because it's quite an effort to get these new codes adopted. It costs some money. It's an impact on the design community, the contracting community to go to the new codes. So we typically skip a cycle. So in this case, we're proposing to go from the 2012 to the 2018. We talked with you back, let you know in May of this year that we were embarking on this process, and we've made some good progress since then in terms of working with our Building Code Advisory Board. We had a community meeting. We've had some one-on-one meetings. We've obviously had some communications with the fire districts. So there's been a variety of different inputs. We've been meeting with the Building Code Advisory Board on a monthly basis since May. To go over the details of the codes and get their recommendations on some of the critical kind of policy issues. We hosted a community-wide meeting back in August, middle of August. We noticed that was published at the city's website, as well as an email was sent to all of our licensed contractors. We didn't get great attendance, unfortunately. People are busy, but they were certainly afforded that opportunity. We also have hosted some more one-on-one or small group meetings with some of the builders that do a lot of work in town, notably some of the townhome builders, knowing that we were proposing the sprinkler requirement, as well as some other requirements that will go through this evening that would have an impact on them, and wanted to get their input before just marching down that road so that we could provide that input to you as policymakers as well. The package as it's kind of presented in your packet is really where we think we'd like to land in terms of drafting an ordinance, but obviously we're here for your input. But we're kind of through with our staff vetting process. The Building Code Advisory Board has taken their kind of final action on this, unless there's some other policy issue that you want to send back to them, but they've essentially endorsed the changes as we're proposing them tonight. So with that, I think the most productive thing to do would really be to go over the majority of the highlights of some of the more significant local amendments and some of the new appendices that we're proposing to be adopted this year, and give you a little background on why we're proposing to do that. So unless there's any kind of preliminary questions, I'd propose to just jump into it. Jumping in.
Okay.
On page 2 of the packet, under International Building Code Modifications towards the bottom of the page, this is really kind of an administrative thing, but we've generally tried to keep up in terms of how we value permits. The International Code Council periodically provides updated valuation tables for different types of construction. And you're required when you submit a building permit in Wheat Ridge to be within the range of those. So you have to be at least at the minimum of whatever they say a type, I'm making this up now, but R3 construction.
Yeah, type 5B building.
That has to, it's a minimum of $100 a square foot or something like that. So your valuation has to fall within that minimum, at or over that minimum. There's some ambiguity in the code in terms of how those ICC valuation tables get adopted. So the language that we're proposing here is that they just kind of will automatically update as ICC publishes a new valuation table. So just kind of a logistical, administrative fix that clears up just a little bit of ambiguous language, so that we don't have to come back and potentially come back to council or something like that every time the International Code Council updates their valuation tables, particularly in a rapidly changing construction cost environment. Moving on to page 3, and just jump in here. I'll take comments, questions as we go. I think just that's probably the most productive format for this evening. The first bulleted point on the top of page 3, this is a topic that came up at a recent city council meeting. Fire Marshal Kroll, as well as some members of the homelessness advocacy community, testified as to some proposed amendments that really are coming from that homelessness advocacy group, but that have been coordinated to some extent with the fire districts that would allow existing churches to house homeless persons for limited periods of time and in limited numbers, provided certain standards are met relative to things like lighted egress signs, the requirement to have a night watch, so someone that's there and watching the facility. It doesn't bring them up to, and Bruce made this clear, any kind of residential standard of occupancy in terms of things like fire suppression. But it ensures a higher degree of safety than no regulations at all. So we're proposing that as a compromise solution.
I had a question on that.
Yep.
The way it's written, and this is on page 5 of the actual legislation, I guess it's a different page numbering. But it says in number 2, rooms and spaces within places of worship providing overnight homeless sheltering for fewer than 50 occupants for less than 16 hours shall be classified as part of the primary occupancy. And then provided the aggregate area for sleeping is less than 10,000 feet, and it goes on to these other things. If it's part of the primary occupancy, would that allow for overnight lodging?
No, this is specifically addressed for assembly occupancies for churches.
Right.
So I don't think that the intent was to for.
I didn't think so either, but I would add the following after as part of the primary occupancy, comma, notwithstanding any provisions of this code which would disallow overnight occupancy in such rooms and spaces, and provided the aggregate area for sleeping is less than, because it says that it's part of the underlying occupancy, but the underlying occupancy doesn't allow this, and so it doesn't matter what qualifications you put on it if you don't say notwithstanding that underlying occupancy doesn't allow it, we're going to allow it notwithstanding that, so.
Because this section is under the definition of assembly occupancy, specifically
Yes.
to A3.
Yeah, it was number,
303.
303.1.4.2.
Yep.
Okay.
If there's consensus around that, when it comes time for that, if you could just get us that.
I can do that, and does everybody kind of see where we're going there? Does that make sense, and do we have consensus on that?
Okay.
Here, there you go. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Great. Any other questions on that? The next bullet, we're proposing to add back something that we amended out of the code, and for the life of me, can't really reconstruct the history as to why we did or didn't do that, but we're adding back in some live-work unit requirements. You may be aware that the Toll Brothers Townhome Project has some potential live-work townhomes as part of their 200-unit project up at Ridge Road and Ward Road by the TOD station. Live-work is a kind of a housing concept that's been around for a long time. Successful in some regards, not as successful other times, but basically just gives people the ability to have some very low-intensity commercial uses on the first floor of an otherwise residential townhome. Maybe have an architect's office or a law office or a small boutique, but low impact commercial uses are allowed, and it loosens the restrictions somewhat of how much fire separation you have to have between that unit and the above unit, because the fire separation can get quite expensive.
A 2-hour separation, your floors have to be separate, no doors intervening.
Mr. Matthews?
Well, that raises the question, and we were just in it. Kind of relates back to the townhouse issue that I want to get to later, but if they're living upstairs and they're there at midnight sound asleep, or I had 3 cocktails, do we not want them to have more fire separation time to get out? Because they're not going to be able to just go out a window. And is there egress going to be? Is there going to be an egress to the outside that comes down from upstairs, or do they have to egress through the lower building, the lower floor?
They would go through the lower floor.
And so wouldn't you want more fire separation in that case, or else? It's the same argument that we had for the townhouses and wanting sprinkler systems and all that.
Actually, that's a very good point. Actually, this live work unit requirement does require them to sprinkler the building.
Because it'd be townhome construction, and if the amendments are adopted as proposed, which would add the fire sprinkler requirement to townhomes, that unit would be sprinklered.
That's a good point. That is another separate requirement. So this is in the building code.
Oh.
And the 419 is in the building code. So it does treat this as an R2, like an apartment occupancy. So it would require it to be sprinklered.
Okay, so I mean that's not up to debate tonight, like the townhouse fire sprinklers.
Correct. That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Randy.
And that typically would have two means of egress?
I would think so. I don't know specifically.
Okay.
But it would have to meet the egress requirements of Chapter 10 in the building code. So certainly
Okay.
it would be met.
Thank you. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. The next bullet, so the third bullet on page 3, this came up from some business owners in the community when we were first entertaining the allowance of various marijuana uses or operators in the city, and specifically infused product manufacturing. The industry was very young, I think, and there were some concerns with whether kind of the technologies in extracting marijuana products from marijuana were tested and were going to be safe. So on the conservative side, City Council at staff's recommendation restricted the ability to use combustible extraction methods. And that was essentially more restrictive for the marijuana industry than it would be for any other kind of manufacturing use that could do those under certain hazardous occupancies. At the request of the industry and our recommendation, because we think that the industry has evolved so much and the technologies have evolved, and it's well regulated by the state as well as by the international codes in terms of the safety of these moderate hazard areas. So we're proposing to take that language out of the last code adoption that specifically targeted marijuana extraction. And this was something that I think Councilman Dozman had encouraged us to, Councilwoman Dozman had encouraged us to do as well, or to consider. Moving on to page 4, that first bullet is fairly straightforward. It's just it's something that we remove an exemption from the code for small decks that don't serve as that are certain small in area and don't serve as a required egress landing area. We're exempting them from permit requirements.
Why is that? If the caveat there, they're not attached to the dwelling unit. What difference does it make if they're attached? Like if they're up 12 inches and they've put a header, into the foundation of the building?
Well, if they're not part of the egress component, like one of the exit doors, let's say the front door, like a front porch, if they're not that part of the egress component, it's really not that significant to have like a deck in the backyard. That's like less than 3 inches off the ground.
But Mr. Matthews, if they are attached to the building, as you described the situation, I think that's when we want to review structural issues related to how that attachment is going to maintain the structural integrity of the house.
30 inches is where we start handrails, guardrails?
That's correct. We're requiring guardrails at 30 inches.
The second bullet on page 4, this is kind of a minor one as well, but it just happened to come up recently. Someone inquired about what the permitting or what the licensing requirements were for residential lawn sprinkler installers, and we do in fact require a license for them to do work in the city, and then we permit that work. Under state law, the any work pertaining to the backflow protector, which is what we really care about, because that ensures the integrity of the city's potable water supply. So that has to be done under state law by a state licensed plumber and a city licensed plumber. So that work has to be licensed and permitted in that way. But we got to talking about, well, what value does it add to license and permit the actual residential lawn sprinkler work? So the laying of the lines and the installing of the heads, which probably all of us have done a little bit of in our lives. When, as a practical matter, our inspections for those are not terribly substantive in terms of like proving up the system, pressurizing it, and looking for leaks or anything like that. So we just didn't seem like we were adding a lot of value there. So we're proposing to exempt out the licensing requirement for residential lawn sprinkler installers, and therefore the permitting for the same.
So you're going to blow out the sprinkler permit?
Yes.
Yep.
So to speak.
Leave people to their own devices. The next bullet is an important one, the requiring automatic fire sprinkler systems in residential townhomes. And this, I know the woman from the Home Builders Association has left, but she had mentioned one of the reasons why we might argue that we don't need this requirement is that there's 2-hour fire separation between units, and while that's true and that's important, that really isn't the primary point of our proposal to agree with the fire districts and add this into the code. The concern really is if you are up on a 3rd floor or rooftop deck, or and the fire starts in the kitchen, that having a fire suppression system in place increases the safety for the occupants of the house, not the occupants of the unit next door. So these have been in the codes. The requirement for actually all residential structures to have fire suppression has been in the codes for quite some time. And many communities, to be honest, have amended it out. We're proposing to still amend it out for single-family homes and duplexes, but to keep it in for townhomes. The Building Code Advisory Board did discuss this multiple occasions at some length and very much supports this requirement. There was actually some interest among that group in going further in terms of actually instituting that requirement for duplexes and or single-family homes.
If we're permitting and requiring fire suppression systems in residential homes, is there a yearly inspection or something, and is there ongoing cost involved in that?
Well, for one of the type of systems that are installed would be like it's just a combination system that is part of the plumbing system. So they're really necessarily going to be a required inspection each year, because each time you use a flush a toilet or open a sink, the system gets purged. So you always know that there's water in the system, and it doesn't require a backflow system either. So that's something that wouldn't be required to be tested every year.
Thank you.
Ms. Hoppy?
I actually have a few questions. And what you just said brought up another question. So if it's not being inspected or tested each year, then truly the maintenance to make sure that the sprinkler heads and all that stuff are clean, not full of grease, that would be able to react properly, is up to the homeowner, but with no other secondary inspection or anyone else, a professional looking at it to make sure that
It wouldn't be a requirement, no.
it is.
It would not be a requirement,
It's not a
but
requirement.
it could.
Therefore, it could go on it could just not be taken care of eventually if it's not required every year for someone to look at it.
That's correct.
Okay. What do our neighbors have? So in the letter that Heidi sent, 92% of the Front Range municipalities and counties have continued to amend the residential sprinkler requirements out of their updated codes. So what do our neighbors actually have?
So in the letter provided by the fire districts, they gave us some examples of cities that actually are requiring fire sprinklers. So we've got Boulder, Boulder County, Castle Pines, Centennial, Cherry Hills, Colorado Springs, Federal Heights. I know they're a little more further out. Fraser, Fort Collins, Golden requires fire sprinklers, Granby, Grand County, Greeley, Louisville, Morgan County, Snowmass, Superior, Westminster, and Winter Park. So there's several jurisdictions near us that do require sprinklers.
So Arvada, Lakewood, Golden.
Golden does.
Golden is.
Golden does, Westminster does. At this time, Arvada does not. That's, yeah, they're looking into that.
They're looking at their 2018 codes right now.
Great. And then what did the builders say when you guys did outreach and asked them specifically about this?
Concerns with the cost. They were, we met with, I think, 4 or 5 of the townhome builders that are doing work in town, and, it wasn't, I would say they're opposed to it for cost reasons. They weren't, I thought maybe some might be here tonight. It was a very good discussion with them, and we talked to them about a few other code amendments that they were generally fine with. This was probably the one that they were most opposed to, but I wouldn't say adamant in that regard. I think they get it on some level that it is a potential safety feature.
Mr. Matthews?
Well, the thought that just came to mind to me and earlier was the young lady said that really the cost can actually be, by the time you get to design and all this, like $3 a square foot. So just for round numbers, if you got about with 3 stories, the 3,000 square foot townhouse, you're talking about 10 grand. And that's the asking price, but 99% probably of these townhomes are going to have a 30-year mortgage, and we all know that that multiplier is probably about 5. So in essence, over the life of that mortgage, that sprinkler system's going to cost 50 grand to the homeowner. So is there, I'm just bringing up a benefits to cost ratio and the impact there of what that 50 grand could mean to homeowners too.
Yeah.
And it's just like the insurance companies. It's all an actuary game. Is there going to be a fire or isn't there?
Ms. Hoppy?
Sorry, my last question was, what about if someone's remodeling townhouses, is there a certain percentage of how much they're remodeling that townhouse to where they would have to retrofit one in, or would it only be from forward new builds?
Okay.
Generally, only forward-looking new builds.
Yeah, so at this time, the code only requires fire sprinklers in new construction. If you do an addition or an alteration to an existing home that does not have fire sprinklers, the code does not require you to provide fire sprinklers in that addition, or even in an existing home.
Ms. Davis?
So that just answered my question about kind of the grandfathering in. The next question is, would it be grandfathering in also builds that are in process?
So if I could defer that to a further, we have a question about grandfathering in, just your question, as it pertains to this and several other proposed amendments. So we want to ask you that question
separate
at the end of the meeting after we've gone through all the amendments, because it applies to this as well as some other things potentially.
Okay, because that, I did look at the list of grandfathering and I have questions about that too. One other thing I have a question about with fire sprinkler systems, and it kind of goes back to kind of the church and how, we're kind of setting that up a little bit differently for refuge for folks that need the cover and a warm place. But I guess my other question is how are we handling this with businesses that are in residential areas? Like say, for instance, some of those homes that might be housing, it could be an addiction or sober living facility and those kinds of things where it really is a business, but they are residing there. So I'm just curious how we code that, because I'm not sure we always code our R2 areas if they're actual business appropriately. So how would we handle that with like sprinklers?
Yeah, we're talking about group homes.
Yeah.
And group homes are currently, I know it's on a future agenda item, but they're currently, certain classes of group homes that are protected classes under ADA are then protected under the Fair Housing Act to be operated as if they were single-family homes. So they still have certain occupancy limits. And for certain populations, there's different additional egress requirements for different populations, but there's no, and the occupancy limits are the same as they would be for a single-family home. So to have a double occupancy in a room, for instance, you have to have a certain size room, that sort of a thing. But there wouldn't be any fire suppression because it's as if it's a single-family home.
Okay, so I just, and I'm glad we're talking about it another time, because I think that what we find is they're more than just a double occupancy in these rooms. That, and I know you and I looked at one once, it was a couple years back, that the language was a little vague as far as the number of occupants. So I know it's another issue, but I was just curious how they'd handle things like that.
Mr. Urban?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Not knowing anything about the construction of a fire sprinkler system, but along the lines of the solar-ready process, is there a way to put it into code that says that a building should have some sort of implement or some way to allow for a fire sprinkler system to be implemented at some point in the future, but build it in such a way that it's ready to be installed in that way, or do all fire sprinkler systems have to be built at the time of construction? Is there any way to sort of prime it for that, but not necessarily have to have it installed? Or is it something?
Yeah, basically when the structure's all open, that's when you would want to install your sprinkler piping. I mean, I don't really see the benefit of not, finishing the system up at that time, because if you've got all your piping in place, it possibly would be connected to the water supply, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to make sure you're sizing your water tap correctly. You'd have to make sure and then you'd have to, as Randy was saying, you'd have to basically go into all of your ceilings and tear out drywall and, replace drywall. I mean, if you put the plumbing in and then just, there wouldn't be any point in not, I think, just finishing it off.
Okay. Then is this, this is contemplated for townhome developments, so is the thinking that there'll be a fire line brought in, a separate fire line brought to the building for the system?
No, this would be on the existing water tap.
Okay, so this is going to be on your existing domestic water tap?
That's correct, yes.
And so you'll tap off of that, what might be a 5/8 or something tap? And
yes.
Or 3/4,
more likely
3/4, or in my house, it was sort of an old 1/2-inch galvanized that was, it's about 1/8 of an inch by the time you got there. And why, but you would not include condominiums and duplexes and single family and duplexes.
Single family and duplexes.
And I guess triplexes and fourplexes, or rental property?
Wouldn't matter whether it's rental or owner occupied. Condominiums are definitely going to be generally going to be classified as apartments from a construction standpoint, so they would already be required to have sprinklers. Triplexes and fourplexes, I think, would be considered townhomes essentially. So if this were adopted as proposed, they would be subject to the sprinklering requirement.
Okay, so would it be a traditional townhome concept? So on a townhome, I think, and I don't know the real distinction, but you own the ground that you sit on. You own from the earth, and so it has to do with ownership.
And
both
separation.
Ownership and construction type.
Yeah.
In terms of, but yes, you're correct. Townhome ownership contemplates owning the land as well.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Urban.
So, would each unit have its own separate fire suppression system? But there would be no unifying system in that regard, or?
Correct.
Okay. And so, like in the roof area that's common to them all, that wouldn't have any fire suppression, or it would just be limited to that one unit?
So with this requirement in the residential code, like attic spaces aren't required to be sprinklered, so it's just in the living areas. The garages aren't required to be sprinklered as well. So it'd be just in the units themselves.
Mr. Matthews?
That was just a point I was thinking. It seems like in a situation like that, the roof area would be vital to keep it from separate from, you know, if the fire starts on the third floor, to keep it from spreading over to the neighboring units on each side. Because that's what it looked like to me for this apartment fire we just had over on Tabor, you know, is that things spread through the attic way.
Yeah, well, that 2-hour separation wall between the units actually does go to the other side of the roof deck.
Okay.
So you do have that separation in the attic
And
spaces.
I was, you know, I'm getting back to the cost, and because I asked that question, I've had a second thought about that. Why would you have to upsize, particularly upsize the tap and what have you? Because it's not like you go flush 6 toilets at the same time, and where you have to be able to handle multiple flows. I mean, these sprinklers will go off one at a time because they're heat-based. So I doubt if anyone's going to stop to take a dump on the way out and cut down on the flow. So why wouldn't the normal piping, you know, 3/4-inch main feeds throughout the house be sufficient?
And with these proposed systems, they are.
So there's really not that much extra cost. It's just a few feet of pipe to run while everything is open before it's
Correct.
before
And the material of piping actually drives the cost of its, you know, PEX, plastic, CPVC, or copper. Obviously, copper is the most expensive.
So that kind of revises my thinking a little bit about the 50 grand. Thank you.
Do we have a consensus in one way or another on that, or do you want to wait on that, or?
Probably ought to wait on that, unless you're ready to.
I'd like to make a consensus that we do not include the fire sprinkler system in residential townhomes.
Well, that's majority consensus.
Okay. Going to the second to last bullet on page 4 again, the radon control. As you're probably all aware, you know, radon is a fairly significant issue in the state of Colorado, and we are proposing to adopt Appendix F, which would essentially require radon control systems to be installed in all new residential homes. That was discussed certainly by the Building Code Advisory Board and also by the developer builders that we met with, and both of those groups supported it.
Most of the developers saying they're installing these passive system already.
Can you describe what that system might be and what the cost implications are?
I could describe what the system is, yes. That's the cost. I'm not quite sure on that. So basically, it's a sub-slab system where there's some gravel in the slab, and there's a vent pipe that goes from the slab through the roof, and that off gases off. Let the gases.
And then an active system would put a fan to that.
Right, so this is a passive system where you just have a vent, and then if there's a higher, I guess, density of radon gas that's detected, you could actually have a fan that'll kind of draw more of the gas out.
So you would be looking at a permeable gas, gravel layer?
Correct.
Of what, 6 inches, do you think, or a foot, or 2 or 3 inches?
I believe about 6 inches. There's specific requirements in the appendix that tells you how to do the system.
So that would occur over the whole footprint of the building?
Of the slab, yes. Either the basement or, let's say, crawl space, or the slab on grade.
Okay, so but it would cover the whole, the whole building. And so you might have, if you had a crawl space, you would have one pipe for the crawl space, I assume, with a fan if you motorize it, and then you would have underneath the slab in the garage, you might have another, you would have gravel down there, and then would you have another fan?
No, it would be, they all could be combined to one vent
Yeah.
at the, let's say, roof level. So they could be combined, and you don't need one fan. You won't have to have multiple fans.
Right.
But most of these systems are just passive, or they're just the vent pipe itself only.
Okay. And do we require radon detection anymore? Is that still a feature?
Radon detection.
Detecting radon? Okay.
No.
We had
Carbon monoxide. not radon.
Ms. Hoppy?
Just from experience, my company has put a lot of the radon removals into homes. It typically is one of those things where it's pretty easy to retrofit, and the real estate agents, whenever they're selling a home, usually suggest, tell your seller that they need to add this to it. And so this would be something it's already getting added to a lot of homes as they cycle through the market. And so just having it already there would be typical. It's going to end up there eventually.
Mr. Matthews?
Do we have any data or experience on the occurrence of radon in Wheat Ridge? I mean, it says, due to the geology in Colorado, but we're just 9 square miles out of that geology. Do we have any data on the occurrence of radon in the city?
No.
So we don't know if we're batting blind or.
Well, Colorado has a very active area, and we have very high levels of radon in our area.
Okay. Ms. Hoppy?
Some of it depends on your dwelling also. However, I can tell you that when my home was tested before we bought it, it was very high above what is considered acceptable level of radon.
Ms. Davis?
Well, and it's funny, we just had this conversation like a week ago with, isn't it a lot of how they test it too? It's a little loaded how they test it, because they shut the door and then they go in and swoop the air, and it's shut door, whereas normally you don't sit in that room in a shut door. There's ventilation throughout the house the whole time, but they shut the door for like a day and go in and do that. That's how they tested just recently. Yeah, so, I mean, I don't know, I have mixed feelings about this one too, because it's kind of like, how's another way that we can, it's just interesting how they test it, because it is a little loaded.
Well, this has come up also with the newer homes. They're all more energy efficient. They're built tighter, so there's not much air escaping. So this is, bringing the levels a little bit higher than normal, perhaps.
I guess nobody sits in a room with the door shut for
Understood.
Would the code read a minimum of a passive ventilation system, or is there a maximum? I mean, when we do something, or is that how we would write the code, is to have a passive system?
Yeah, I don't think it says a minimum. I think it just says a passive.
Okay. The notes that we have says a minimum of a passive system, passive ventilation system.
So that's like the least requirement. You have to be provide a passive system. If you want to go above and beyond and provide the fan operated system, then that's.
Okay, thank you.
The Colorado Department of Health shows the whole state of Colorado as a zone 1, which is high radon potential, for whatever that's worth.
Is there any way to pre-test the site? I mean, can you go out and drill a test hole and determine if the site requires it? And maybe that should be part of our. I mean, I don't know. Can you go out, just drill a 10-foot deep hole and drop something down?
Well, I believe there's always going to be some type of radon inside the soil. It's better if the house is containing it and trapping it inside. So I'm not sure if testing the soil would be beneficial or not. But no, to answer your question, I don't know if that would be a benefit or not.
I mean, you usually do soils testing, and I was just thinking, well, while you're there for checking to see if it's clay or silty clay or expansive clay, can you do a radon test while you're there? And maybe you need it, maybe you don't. I just was curious.
I think you could. I think the challenge would be you're going to most likely find radon, and I think you don't really know how that radon manifests itself as a safety hazard inside the house until at some point the house gets built, because it depends on construction, on how airtight it is, whether it's a basement versus a slab. There's a lot of different factors that factor into whether radon becomes a problem in the house. So I think maybe there is a way to do that testing in advance, but I'm not sure that there is.
Okay,
Is
well,
there
why don't we
consensus one way or the other on that?
Why don't we move forward, and then we'll circle back and get consensus on all of these issues.
Well, I think that if we do it one at a time.
You want to do it one at a time? Sure, that's okay.
Another
Yeah.
dozen, so.
Okay.
So I'd just like to make a consensus that we keep radon as proposed into the new updated building codes.
Okay, we have consensus on that.
Thank you. Last one on page 4 is a proposal to adopt Appendix J for existing buildings and structures. We think this is a really important one. As you're all well aware, we've got an older building stock in the city, both residentially and commercially. This appendix just gives you a little more flexibility in terms of how you work with those existing buildings and bring them into compliance with certain aspects of modern codes and not full compliance with certain aspects of modern codes. This is really stems also from a recommendation in the neighborhood revitalization strategy, which recommends that we look at creative ways to make sure that we're making it, as facilitating reinvestment in our existing building stock, whether it be commercial or residential. So we think it aligns well with that.
Do we have consensus on leaving that in, or any questions? I'm sorry, any questions first? Or consensus to leave this proposal in the code? Okay, that one will be good. That's okay.
Thank you, Mayor.
Would you like to go back to the space sheeting? The bullet point above the radon, we had lumber sheeting.
Yeah, I'm skipping a few things
okay.
that I think are kind of minor, but yeah,
Okay.
The code used to allow for some spacing between sheathing, but really that's no longer considered best practice at all. And most shingle manufacturers won't even allow any spacing in your sheathing, like if you have old plank sheathing. So this is really just kind of modernizing to that new kind of best practice in roof sheathing.
Any questions on this? So this is to not have spacing between the sheathing, or
Correct.
to have spacing between the, to not?
To not require solid pieces of decking,
Okay. But you do,
like solid OSB, solid plywood.
right. But you put a space between the sheathing?
You would, between each.
Between
would
each
for
one you do?
expansion and contraction,
Yep,
you would,
yep,
a small
okay.
gap, that's correct.
Okay. And this sort of allows for that, but not too much gap?
It does. A lot of manufacturers, like shingles, they would require the maximum spacing of any space decking is like 1/4 of an inch.
Okay.
So,
Do we have consensus to move this one forward? We do. Okay.
Okay, moving to page 5, the first bullet there. This is a little different one. Adopting Appendix Q, which is a new appendix in the 2018 codes that allows for tiny houses, which would be houses that are 400 square feet or less. Tiny houses is obviously, somewhat of a thing, right? Some communities have made accommodations for them. Certainly, they've become a affordable housing solution for some communities, including Denver and some other, I know mountain communities have had some tiny house communities established. The challenge as it pertains to the building codes for tiny houses is they often don't comply with minimum egress standards, like the stairways or the whatever kind of means of getting up to a loft sleeping area often don't meet those requirements. The clear height for the ceilings in those sleeping areas don't meet code requirements for typical residential construction. So what this code does is modify some of those requirements to allow tiny houses under kind of reasonable standards. So it's really a first step in the process of whether we would ever allow them. Tiny houses have a lot of other challenges when it comes to zoning issues. Minimum lot sizes, right? I mean, you're not going to plop a 400 square foot house on a 12,000 square foot, $125,000 residential lot in Wheat Ridge, I don't think. That math just doesn't make sense. Different water and sanitation districts may or may not require a full water tap. So, you're looking at $10,000, $15,000 on top of whatever the cost of the tiny house is. So what we view this, so there's a lot of other kind of obstacles that you need to work through. What, in my mind, this does is it gets one step out of the way if council would ever want to entertain a planned residential district that would allow for tiny houses in some sort of I have no idea whether that would be the case. We haven't gotten an application. We've certainly gotten some passing inquiries, but it wouldn't really allow just a one-off tiny house to pop up in your neighborhood because of those other issues pertaining to zoning and to water and sewer taps. But it would, and as a point of clarification, if it has wheels, it's an RV and would have to comply with the RV regulations and couldn't be used as a housing option in Wheat Ridge. So again, it's in our mind a first step in the process of, if they were to be identified to be appropriate someplace in Wheat Ridge, then we would have at least addressed the building code requirements.
Mr. Matthews?
I think we're putting the cart before the horse. Right now, we don't allow tiny houses, so let's not put anything in the code that refers to them.
Mr. Urban?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So in this instance, these codes would apply to a tiny house if it was on a lot in Wheat Ridge. And what if in the instance where someone is manufacturing tiny houses for use in other jurisdictions, would these codes apply in that circumstance when they're constructing them in Wheat Ridge but not necessarily applying for a CO on a particular lot? They're just building them.
Yeah, I don't know if the state, the state regulates the construction of RVs.
Manufactured homes, they wouldn't,
Yeah.
they don't regulate something this small. So it's either an RV or it's going to be regulated somehow by a third party, or this appendix that was put in the code brand new 2018 to regulate it from the building code.
But if someone were to create a manufacturing facility in an industrial district in town, I don't know that we would enforce this building code as part of that manufacturing process, because we don't know where those are going to locate, and that jurisdiction may be following these codes, or they may be following the Alabama, or the Georgia has its own set of building codes, California has its own set of building codes.
Right.
They could be ending up anywhere, so I don't think we'd use this to regulate the manufacturing.
Would not use.
Would not.
Okay. And then in the assumption that you made, you indicated that someone would not put a tiny home on a 12,000 square foot lot, but what if they wanted to?
They could, yeah, sure.
So that'd be the only structure on the property, and as long as it wasn't on wheels, then...
Yep, I was making just a leap of faith that that's unlikely given the underlying land cost, but you're absolutely right.
I think it's, when it comes to tiny homes, it's not necessarily the money involved, it's more the lifestyle, and so you don't know exactly what is contemplated when you put it out there. So I would be reticent to put this out there without some additional framework around where and how they can be out there, but I'm not opposed to tiny houses. My daughter loves tiny houses, and we took a tour of the tiny home village up near Netherland, I think is what it was. So, but I don't know that we're ready for implementing this as it stands.
Additional discussion? Ms. Weaver?
I have to go there. So if I wanted to put a tiny house on a single-family square lot right now, I could do that.
If there were not already a single-family house on that lot.
Right. If I just bought a lot and I put the single, or could I not do it?
You could not do it right now, very likely, unless you adopt Appendix Q.
Okay, and the only thing...
They don't meet the egress requirements, they don't meet the headroom requirement for sleeping quarters, they don't meet the minimum size for sleeping quarters. There's a variety of existing residential codes that they don't meet.
And the thing that keeps it from becoming a tiny house village is the fact of the zoning of what I would put on that, right, if it was single family, and if it was R2 or R3, I still couldn't put 2 tiny homes on there.
Well,
I'm challenging it, right? Like if we have this, because I think you're right. If you can do it, I mean, because this is a lifestyle choice that people are making, so I think we should be ready for the fact that I don't think it's that tiny homes necessarily come in groups. Sometimes they're all on their own, or if it were a triplex situation, or right, the lot was big enough. Could I put 3 tiny homes on there?
No. So if you had a single family zone lot, you could do 1 tiny home.
Right.
If you had a duplex lot, you could do a duplex, but I'm not aware, you couldn't do 2 tiny homes. If you
Right.
had an R3
You have to
zone
be a
lot,
duplex tiny home? Does that exist?
If you're zoned
That's
for-
awesome.
If you're zoned for like a triplex, you couldn't do 3 tiny homes. Those are not divisible parts.
But I could do 3 tiny
No, you
triplexes.
couldn't. You could do 1 tiny home.
Well, I guess that's what I'm asking
Right
is,
now, we consider it a single-family home.
right, but you have, in other words, you have rules though. If I sort of kept coming to you with my different zone that I own, that's empty, and I want to try and figure out how to put tiny homes on it, it sounds like you do have answers for, no, you can just have 1 tiny home, and that's fine if you want to do it in an R1, which I am totally okay with. If people want to live in a tiny home, I think what I'm hearing that Wheat Ridge is sort of responding to is the tiny home village. And I'm just trying to say, I think we have rules in place that would stop the tiny home village, but it wouldn't stop someone from living in a tiny house on their R1 lot.
Well, it would right now.
Right, it would right now, but I'm saying this thing.
Right.
So I think I'm for this because it sounds like it's not saying we're allowing tiny houses or we're not allowing tiny house villages. We're allowing people, if they want to live in a small home, the right to do that on a small home, on a residential home lot. Is that correct? Okay, thank you for clarifying that.
Mr. Matthews?
If we're ready, I would ask for a consensus that we do not adopt Appendix Q for tiny houses.
Looks like that did not pass, so we will allow tiny homes.
You know, one comment, I understand where we're coming from, that we don't want to put the cart before the horse, and if we haven't addressed ADUs and that kind of thing. But I guess the reason why I'm supporting this is, again, just because it's in a situation where there's an empty lot, I bought it and I put my tiny home on it. It's not that I'm going to go behind my house and add 1 or put 3 on or those types of things. It's just empty lot, I'm rolling in, and I'm not going to roll in too long because I can't have wheels. So I'm just dropping it off there, and that's my new home.
Your only home.
Yes.
Mr. Urban?
Can I ask one of the other council members on that, on the affirmative side of that, to make a consensus that the consensus that was made was to not do that. That's not necessarily a consensus to move forward, so.
Ms. Hoppy?
I'd like to make a consensus to adopt Appendix Q in the IRC for tiny houses.
That generates consensus. Thank you very much for that clarification.
Okay, a few more. The Appendix T is another, this is actually a recommendation that came to us. It's a proposal to make solar-ready provisions for new homes. And this would apply to all new single-family duplexes and townhomes. Is that correct, Randy?
Yeah, that's correct for single-family and 2-family dwellings and townhomes.
And so essentially this is a recommendation coming to us from the Sustainability Committee that would require that certain provisions are made to make the home ready for a solar panel installation if the homeowner should choose to do so. So things like getting conduit up to the roof to accommodate the wiring, things like accommodating circuitry on the electrical panel.
Yep. Having certain zones on the roof for panel installations, so it's not, let's say, neighboring trees or the neighboring buildings not shading that particular area. So it's kind of a lot of different planning.
Would this be any more than a conduit and an enhanced roof structure? I mean, you mentioned some electrical work, and that seems more complicated to me.
Not so much the work, but just the capacity in the panel.
Right, no, just like an extra circuit breaker, so we could add that circuit breaker for the solar inverter, basically. So just room in the panel for.
Okay, so you need a spare circuit in the panel?
Yes, correct, but it's not adding anything at this time.
Okay.
Right, except for the conduit, perhaps.
Mr. Urban?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. With respect to the shading on Appendix T, it indicates the solar-ready zone shall be set back from any existing or new permanently affixed object on the building or site that is located south, east, or west of the solar zone, a distance not less than 2 times the object's height above the nearest point on the roof surface. Such objects include, but are not limited to, taller portions of the building itself, parapets, chimneys, antennas, signage, rooftop equipment, trees, and roof plantings. One of my concerns in here is regarding the use of the word trees, in that in many cases, the planting of a tree adjacent to a building is to reduce energy consumption. By including that in this discussion around the shading and where these can be, in my mind, that gets into a situation where we're telling people where they can and cannot plant trees, which is the original solar panel. And so I just want to keep it from getting in a situation where, because of these requirements, we're either limiting the shading of trees or telling anybody where they can plant a tree, because that, in my mind, reduces the energy consumption much greater than a potential solar panel might. So do you understand whether or not that would impact someone's desire to plant a tree or have an impact on where the solar-ready zone would be?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. I think that might have some type of impact. I know this section right here, if you see, it's a new. You see a bar next to it. That's an added section to this here. You could always, the council could not adopt this shadings area. We could adopt and not adopt these particular paragraphs to maybe help alleviate that. Later on in our discussion, we're asking to adopt the residential solar ready in the International Energy Code, and this paragraph is not in there. So it's a little bit different from the Energy Code. So perhaps we could amend this out, if that's one of your concerns, and still have the conduit added and the extra space in the panel, but not this particular shading aspect of it.
Okay, and then looking at the exemptions and the understanding of which properties this would apply to, do we have any indication on the percentage of properties in Wheat Ridge that would be financially feasible, eligible, or otherwise capable of having a solar panel as it stands? Or I saw one report from NAREL that said 20 to 30% of roofs may be eligible for significant solar panels, but I just don't understand what percentage of properties we're looking at would be eligible for solar at all.
Yeah, I don't have those numbers for you tonight.
And I just share, we did bring this requirement to the residential builders that we met with as well, and there was some reticence to adopting this as well. Not so much that they're opposed to it, but just as a practical matter, they raised some concerns. One concern was, certain townhome, and this was specifically to the townhome development community, the covenants and declarations may prohibit them, for better or worse. And two, some units may be just completely not conducive to solar panels at all. And so why run conduit to something that's never going to support a solar panel? And three, was, would 5 years down the road, when the homeowner decided to go with solar panels, would they remember that they were there? Would the contractor that's going to come out and do the solar want to trust someone else's work in terms of the conduit that was installed? So maybe just in that context, make you aware of those concerns were raised as well. But we want to be supportive of also of the Sustainability Committee desire to take some baby steps in terms of addressing some of their concerns.
I would be willing to entertain some kind of incentive or other encouragement of builders to have a solar-ready zone, but there's a lot of concerns that I have regarding the size and weight and the energy capacity of solar panels. And as we look at them today, they may be one, but my expectation is that they become more efficient and smaller over time. And regardless of what we plan for right now, it may change in the future. So I just don't want to be developing these solar-ready zones on roofs that, number one, may not have that capacity, and I'd like to leave that up to the consumer to choose to have that as a part of their build or not. And if we want to incentivize that, I'm all for that, but I just don't want to see it as a mandate.
Ms. Weaver.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I agree with you
Councilman Urban. I'm also sort of picturing a scenario where you have an older home with large trees around it and a new home next to it in a different lot, and it being an excuse to take down the tree because it's now impeding the solar zone of the new house, and I think that would be very problematic. I have a giant tree that, that precludes me, unfortunately, from doing solar, but I love the tree, and I think there could just be some scenarios where, as we're filling in some of these lots that haven't had homes next to old homes, and we're trying to keep some of those trees, I tend to agree that I don't want to create a rule I just don't think it's a one-size-fits-all, though I am very supportive of creating incentive for solar if it works.
Mr. Matthews?
I find it kind of interesting, we spent half of our time over the past year talking about affordable housing, and we're spending half our time tonight talking about how to add cost to housing, and not necessarily in a practical sense. I mean, as Mr. Urban has pointed out, we don't even know if anyone's ever going to put a solar panel on this house, but we're going to raise the cost of it for maybe in case ofs. And I think there again, we're putting the cart before the horse and trying to stipulate something that we have no idea if it's ever going to be used.
Ms. Hoppy?
The cost is super minimal to run a conduit up to the roof and to have an open circuit in your panel. Super minimal. But it may potentially, and as a builder, I would think that it would be a sales point, a marketing point for my building. Now, I do agree with removing the language that Councilmember Urban had discussed about the trees and that, but I think that and to the point of, solar panels may end up smaller and more efficient. You're still going to have to run power to them, and they're still going to have to be capable to retrofit them to people who have solar panels and want to maybe upgrade, and so it's still going to need the circuit. I mean, that's, so anyways, I would, and it still has to go back to the meter to, read back to the meter so that, you can tell the energy company that you don't have to actually pay them. So, so for me, I think this, and it's not expensive. I think that this is one of those things that's super cheap that can help people actually consider, I have a solar-ready house, and so maybe I might want to actually look into that, because at this point, solar panels, they used to be super upside down, but they're really coming into a reasonable cost where the lease on your solar panels is what you're going to pay for your energy bill anyways. And so they're kind of getting to the point where they're a washy-wash. So I think it's important that we look forward to that.
Mr. Urban?
I totally get that a conduit doesn't cost but a few dollars, and that's not the concern that I have. It's the requirements around the solar-ready zone and the amount of square feet on the roof and the lack of any kind of exposure or surrounding it regarding chimneys and parapets and everything else. So it isn't so much about the wire running up from the electrical box, it's the requirements about how the roof is situated and what's around that solar-ready zone on the roof that concerns me and dictates a lot more than just where a wire should be run. So that's my main concern as it relates to this, and it's definitely a selling point. It's a marketing point that a builder should be in a competitive market using those types of tools to entice buyers, but that's a market-driven consideration, and this isn't necessarily something that is going to prohibit or encourage people from doing this. I think we can allow the market to take care of it.
Do you think there's a compromise consensus out there somewhere to maybe mandate the conduit and the spare breaker in an electrical panel? And I guess the third component is sizing the roof joists so that they might accommodate another 2 or 3 pounds per square foot, which is typically what you would need for a solar, and then not to deal with the solar shading areas.
My concern with that, Mr. Mayor, is if you kind of need to know where those solar zones are in order to determine where your conduit's going to go up. So if you don't really know where those are, you're kind of just putting a piece of pipe somewhere in the middle of the attic space and hoping you're close. Because typically we would run that conduit to the solar ready zone. So whatever roof plane the panel's going to go to.
So you would penetrate the roof and...
So in this particular
scenario?
appendix, it does here. In the next paragraph, it tells you to penetrate the roof and put a cap on it at this specific zone.
Ms. Hoppy?
I'd like to ask for a consensus to keep the Appendix T for the IRC solar ready provisions in the adopted codes with the exemption of the shading, which is the T 103.5.
Does that make sense, Randy? I think so.
No, I don't think that does. We still need to provide the solar ready zone. Just basically just the shading aspect is it out. I think it'll become more clear when we get to the energy code, because the energy code.
We weren't going to go over the energy code tonight.
Oh, we weren't. I'm sorry.
No, I mean it's not in the staff report.
Okay.
And if there are things about the energy code.
We're adopting two appendices out of the energy code: the residential solar ready and the commercial solar ready.
Okay.
I'm sorry, it must have been inadvertently left out.
No, it's, I mean, there's just there's one line there, but we can certainly speak to it. So was there?
Well, I guess was that a form of consensus then?
It was an ask.
Okay. So.
It was an ask.
So this was to have the conduit and the roof and the everything except for the shading.
I don't understand, was it resolved or is it still an issue? Because it sounds like you're saying that it has to, we can get rid of the shading, but you still have to know where the solar zone is because the conduit's going to go to a specific place on the roof. And so we can't have the conduit, I mean, it doesn't make sense to have the conduit if we don't know where the solar shading is. Is that, am I understanding that correctly? So that's why I don't feel like I can support the consensus, even though you got rid of the.
There's a.
Mr. Urban?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. T 103.9, RA 103.7, electrical service reserved space. The main electrical service panel shall have a reserved space to allow installation of a dual pole circuit breaker for future solar electric installation and shall be labeled for future solar electric. The reserved space shall be positioned at the opposite end from the input feeder location or main circuit location.
Well, that's at the breaker box.
Right. Just adopt that particular piece to allow for electrical service reserved space for solar panel.
So we're just doing the electrical service. We're not doing the conduit.
It's T 103.9. It's just one sentence. The main electrical service panel shall have a reserved space to allow installation of a dual pole circuit breaker for future solar electric installation and shall be labeled for future solar electric. The reserved space shall be positioned at the opposite load end from the input feeder location or main circuit location.
Do we have consensus on that one?
And that would be the only item from Appendix D, Appendix T, as in Tom. Okay. 103.9, and then it has in parentheses RA 103.7.
Well, the last thing I had, and then Randy, jump in here. It sounds like you got a couple more things, notably energy conservation, was the fire code amendments, which one of those is on the bottom of page 5, and some language continues with kind of the staff analysis of that or discussion of that on the following page 6. And this is the topic of underground detention that was spoken to by some of our earlier speakers as well, Mr. Brooks. The fire district had provided some language for what they had requested for structural loading kind of engineering certifications from for any kind of fire access lanes that are on top of underground stormwater detention vaults. We took a look at that language and, well, let me back up. We increasingly see underground stormwater detention on almost all of our development projects. I would say whether it be the Lucky's project, the Corners, Town Center North, West End 38, the assisted living facility at 44th and Yarrow, pretty much every project, because we're an infill development community, has some form of underground detention. And we think that's generally a good thing. There's some drawbacks to underground detention, some concerns with long-term maintenance because it can be kind of out of sight, out of mind, but there's, I think, solutions to that. And so, we think underground detention is an important part of our kind of development pattern moving forward because it allows for a much more efficient use of land for these infill projects that we see that just frankly don't have land to devote to a big traditional kind of grassy detention pond. So we think that's important. We also share the desire of the fire districts to ensure the structural integrity of all underground systems, whether that be storm pipe or water pipe or there's a lot of stuff underground. And these detention structures are in that mix. A lot of these are proprietary manufactured systems. Several of those projects that I just mentioned are all using the same proprietary manufactured system where the manufacturer of it provides these certification out of the box. The language that was provided by the fire district, I think, was certainly well-intentioned and wanting to ensure that they're not going to be at risk of penetrating these drives because they're not structurally sound underneath. We think we identified some AASHTO, American Association of State Highway Transportation Official language that several other communities are using. Denver uses that, Fort Collins uses it, Commerce City, and I think some others on the Front Range all use that. So we thought that was a good compromise to have something that's official language. Our past practice has just been to, on a case-by-case basis, require those certifications from engineers, just not in the very specific manner that was proposed by the fire district. So we showed that language to a lot of the engineers that we work with on the projects that I just mentioned and others, and they expressed some pretty significant concerns as to whether they'd be able to put their stamp or on something with such level of detail. So we think this more universal standard from AASHTO is a more appropriate way to go. We understand the point load issues as well. I mean, we think we can get to language that works to address that, but the language, again, that the fire district proposed was just asking for too much. And frankly, I think identifying a concern with the underground detention systems specifically that we didn't think was warranted, that underground detention, while it may be new to our community and to some other communities, is not new to the world, right? I mean, we have the West End 38 building is built on top of underground detention. If you're familiar with the 6-story building at Denver, at University of Denver's light rail station, that's built on top of an underground detention vault. So we want to make sure they're structurally sound, and engineers are good at doing that. But we just don't think that the language that was provided by the fire district was going to be workable for us. So that's what we proposed as a compromise. We've actually implemented this AASHTO standard when we became aware of it a week or so ago. The city's stormwater guidelines are administratively adopted. They're not codified, so that we can adjust those as new technologies that we become aware of, whether it be underground or above ground or permeable pavement, or we've got pretty creative engineers when it comes to how we handle detention. So we've always historically just the code authorizes the ability of us to adopt administrative regulations as it pertains to stormwater detention. So we've actually already adopted this AASHTO standard into our published stormwater regulations. We did that last week. So be glad to have discussion about that.
Okay, questions or discussion on the stormwater detention issue that was raised by our fire department. Mr. Matthews.
Do we actually, when we're looking at these site plans and where these underwater detention site vaults are going to be, how do we design for a maximum size fire truck and the outriggers? I mean, it concerns me, being around cranes all my life, building bridges, you get an awful lot of point loading on an outrigger. And we don't even trust the outriggers. We put extra pads underneath them to help distribute the load when we're on hard ground. Are those considerations made when designing these underground detention ponds?
Yeah, I think absolutely on a case-by-case basis, but not just something that we feel like we're in a position to kind of codify citywide, that it really requires that case-by-case analysis.
And how are they determining the point loads when they do this case-by-case analysis?
Well, I'm not a structural engineer, so I'm not sure would be qualified to
I mean,
speak.
who is doing it?
Structural engineers.
For the owner, as part of their submission?
Yeah, for the owner or builder, yeah.
Thank you.
Additional discussion? Mr. Urban?
So is the professional engineer then stamping those plans for the owner then?
Yes, and certifying it at the completion of construction as well.
And have there been any instances of a detention vault collapse or destruction or other sort of deterioration of those over time, or have there been any safety instances regarding these?
We've not had any failures. I know, or any problems. I know Mr. Kroll, who isn't here tonight, but he had forwarded at one point in time, probably a couple of months ago at this point, a photo of a project in Lakewood that had failed. But I think it was, in our opinion, it wasn't a great example. It was like a galvanized pipe system that was under a landscaped area that was, and again, I'm not a civil engineer, but it certainly wasn't a facility that was under fire access drive. It was simply in a detention pond in a landscaped area. So I think they had this piping system that was additional volumetric capacity above the water quality feature that was on top. And it was not properly installed, frankly. But it wasn't the type of concrete vault system that we're typically seeing under our parking lots or fire access drives. It's a very different kind of application.
And as it relates to the fire access drive, is it somehow necessary or common for that vault to be located in that vicinity or otherwise adjacent to the fire access line?
Well, on these tight sites, I think it's oftentimes just inevitable. I mean, to use a couple specific examples, I mean, we, on the Town Center North, the phase of that senior housing that was on the far north end of the site, adjacent to 44th, there's a stormwater detention vault under that parking lot. They actually had to redesign it a little bit because the fire district went from 75,000 pound vehicles to 85,000 pound vehicles. There's an access drive, or there's an underground detention vault in the parking area in front of all the multi-tenant Tokyo Joe's and everything at the corners. There's a underground detention vault in the kind of drop-off area and the south side of the assisted living facility at 44th and Yarrow. So they're often, just because these sites are tight, they're often located in circulation areas.
And is there any outward indication that those exist above ground, or are they only known to those that are aware that they exist? Or
the latter, they wouldn't be signed in any way.
Mr. Matthews?
Are you aware, like for instance at the townhouse, is that strictly a vault, or does it have interior piers or supports? I mean, what kind of is it just a vault the size of this room that a fire truck's going to sit on, or are there, I mean, are they taking I mean, I'm sorry, I just see too many bridge decks that go bad after 50 years and some of them after 20 years, and I'm concerned about how we verify the structural integrity of these 30 years down the road when is anyone inspecting them?
Well, during the installation, of course, yeah, the engineers are inspecting them.
I mean, 30 years down the road. I mean, we have CDOT goes out and inspects their bridges on a revolving annual basis because bridge decks deteriorate. And I'm concerned we don't know what groundwater effects are going to be. I mean, are they using green bar, black bar? I mean, I'm sure some engineer is looking at that, but my concern is not that he can't design it today to withstand the loads of an 85,000-pound truck, but what's going to happen 20 years from now after it's been exposed maybe to groundwater for all this time?
Yeah, I think as with any, I mean, we don't inspect them to answer that question. It would be up to the property owner to have some sort of a inspection maintenance program. They're typically designed in a manner that they have, and Denver's regulations are really, I think, helpful in this regard, where there's minimum kind of clear heights in the facility, so you're able to get in there and evaluate them in the future and clean them out as needed. So there's manholes or access points at periodic minimum distances and minimum clear heights for kind of navigating in there. To answer your previous question about the piers, I think yes, there would be some instances where the vault would be a certain size that you'd have a structural pier intermittently as well. I think the ones that we've seen in Wheat Ridge are typically don't have that volume of requirements. They're not that big that they would require that type of design. They can just be, the structure is formed in the concrete itself.
My concern is, do we have to adopt codes if we're going to allow for, it's really a bridge, underground bridge. If we're going to allow for those in the city, do we need to start an inspection program or have some kind of code addressing the longevity of the structure itself before we do have someday a fire truck drop down through one? Should that be part of this code adoption?
You know, I can't think of anything else that is a private improvement that we would maintain an ongoing inspection program on. I mean, I think everything that gets built in the city at some point, you know, at some point down the road is going to have to be repaired in some regard. Now, we certainly don't want to suggest that we think that these facilities are going to fail and need to be repaired, but again, we don't have an ongoing inspection program to make sure that houses are being kept up or commercial buildings are kept up, and this is really just another private improvement that we approve in the first instance, but we don't typically inspect moving forward.
Additional discussion on this item? Do we have a consensus motion anywhere?
Just as
Mr. Bond.
just because we've talked around this, just a summary of what you're proposing, and because I think essentially you've tried to look at the new code as well as some of the recommendations, and I believe this is an attempt to acknowledge multiple sides of it. Can you just summarize it really quickly?
Yeah, so a couple things. We've adopted the AASHTO standard, which is a highway standard for structural loading. We also, in code section on the bottom of page 6, we're also adding or keeping D 102.1 access and loading, which already requires that facilities, buildings, or portions of buildings hereafter constructed shall be accessible to fire department apparatus by way of an approved fire apparatus access road with an asphalt, concrete, or other approved driving service capable of supporting the imposed load of fire apparatus weighing at least 85,000 pounds. So those are that, and adopting administratively the AASHTO standard are what we're proposing, and then additionally continuing our best practice of requiring structural engineering stamps on the drawings in the first instance for these facilities, and then requiring them sign off on the as-builts at the project completion.
Mr. Keeter?
So just very quickly, if you've administratively adopted the AASHTO and this fire access language is already in the code, do you actually need us to do anything on this part?
This 85,000 pound language, that would be readopted.
Oh, okay.
And that actually was changed from, I think the previous codes had a lower weight because since the 2012 codes were adopted, I think the loading went up from, I don't know, 70 to 85 or 75 to 85.
Okay, then I would ask for a consensus at staff's recommendation.
We have consensus on that then.
Did that pass?
Yes, it did.
So Randy, it sounded like you also wanted some direction on the energy conservation code. Is that still the
Yeah,
case?
so since the direction of the solar-ready provisions of the residential code kind of went a little bit, weren't all accepted, I just want to bring attention to, so we're adopting 2018 energy code, which has 2 proposed appendices to be adopted. Solar-ready provisions for 1 and 2 family detached dwellings and townhomes, which is really the exact language of the Appendix T. So presuming if, and I'm sorry you guys don't have this in front of you, so it's Appendix RA out of the energy code, and then Appendix CA, which is solar-ready zones for commercial buildings. So they're 2 very similar appendices as the residential one with very similar provisions. So I don't know if you wanted to address this at a different time or just adopt the language for the electrical service only and nothing else in the appendices.
I think we just make other amendments to the energy codes to be consistent with council's consensus.
Yeah, okay. And then you can present that next.
Yeah.
Do we have consensus on that? Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. That was all. Yeah, I'm sorry.
And then the last thing that I have, and this came up from Ms. Davis earlier about grandfathering in, and it's maybe somewhat of a moot point. We have a number of different townhome projects that are in various stages of approval and or construction. So the question became, and it was really going to be most applicable to the sprinkler requirement, but the consensus of council was not to requirement that the townhomes have sprinklers in adopting these codes. The radon requirement similarly could be applied retroactively, and the solar-ready requirement could be applied. I say retroactively, I don't mean retroactively, but it could be applied to projects that are in midstream. So let's use the Toll Brothers project as an example. They have their master building permits in place. They don't have any site-specific building permits yet. They likely will before these codes are adopted. We're proposing to adopt the codes at a city council public hearing on December 9th, but that they would go into effect on July 1st of next year. We typically have a lag period so that designers and contractors can kind of get ready for this. So that if someone that's designing a project right now, thinking we're on the 2012s, doesn't have to change midstream and all of a sudden design everything on January 1 to the 2018. So that's been our typical practice, is that we wait about 6 months until they're effective. So we're proposing that they'd be effective on July 1st. So on that July 1st date, the question becomes, for us, which of these requirements would be essentially applied to these projects that are midstream? So Toll Brothers will probably have pulled some of their actual permits. Yarrow Gardens will have pulled, a good portion of their permits, but not all of their permits. So would it be council's desire to let those projects just keep kind of moving forward under how they started, or to need to come into compliance with a couple of these new requirements, notably just the electrical panel on the solar-ready and the radon requirement for their new permits moving forward? So there's just going to be 3, 4, 5 of these projects that, if you want that radon requirement to have an impact, essentially we're going to miss a pretty big opportunity here if we say it doesn't apply if you're already kind of in the pipeline.
Ms. Hobby?
Because I know that radon is so easily fitted into it, even retrofitted, it's certainly easy with brand-new construction and because they don't have their final permit. I would suggest that we ask them to follow the new updated codes. And so I'd like to make a consensus that we do not grandfather in for the radon, that we do grandfather in for the radon and the solar-ready electrical panel in the box. Again, that's really simple. It's just one little switch spot. We do make them come to compliance. We don't. Yes.
So,
Okay, so that, we have consensus on that for those two items. Require those?
Okay, thank you.
can I pose a question?
Yes.
So with that, so are we saying that they need to, all the permits that are going to have these requirements need to build to the 2018 building codes, plus the solar ready provision for the electrical and the radon? Okay.
No, for all the new construction that is in the pipeline, that they meet those two requirements prior to July 1st, the remainder July 1st.
Because
So I have a clarification, because I'm just thinking of the one next to me, Thrive. They've got a bunch built. So I'm assuming that those ones would not apply. It would be from a certain dates, again, like if we give them, so that they can plan, even if it's not as generous as July
If they don't have
something.
their final permits is kind of the, final permits is when the.
And then are we doing it by a certain date? So, I mean, so say this is approved December 9th, are we saying starting December 9th, any permit after that? Or are we going to give a date?
It's July 1st would be the effective date. So effective July 1st, Thrive. 2020. Effective July 1st, 2020.
Because I think she's thinking something
No,
different.
because the consensus I was trying to come to, was that all the work that's in the pipeline currently is required to do the radon systems and the solar-ready provisions. Once these are adopted in December, immediately,
And what does in the pipeline mean?
they're not in final, well, you tell me
Well,
again, because you're the one who brought it
it's
up.
essentially anything that doesn't have a building permit. So, Tollbrook, the way townhomes or a lot of projects work, including single family, is they often apply for master permits that, this is our Sussex model, right? And this is our, block of 4 Sussex townhomes, and we're going to put that here. So they don't actually get a building permit until they know that they're ready to pull the plug on this next phase, this block of 4 townhomes. So, to use Thrive's Yarrow Gardens project as an example, they only have building permits right now for their model homes that are partially complete and still partially under construction. So they will start applying for building permits for specific townhomes once they sell them, which is what they're trying to do now with their model homes. So there's a lot more building permits that will be issued over the next several years. So I think we've got one of two options. We could either make those, based on the consensus motion, we could certainly go, I think the direction of what Ms. Hoppe said was we could make it effective on those 2 requirements, 15 days after public, the typical way an ordinance would be effective. And then make the rest of the codes effective on July 1st. Now, so if that's the consensus.
So that was my intention with the consensus. So if that was not what you consented to, then, okay, great.
Mr. Matthews.
As an ex-contractor, I'm screaming change order. I mean, if they have given you 6 models and we've approved that construction, to change it now and force them to do something different, I don't care if it's a $10 change or a $10,000 change, but over 60 homes, $1,000 change becomes $60,000. I don't think it's fair to change. That's what I call midstream. We've told them your 5 models meet our codes, then you can build them this way. And just because it's maybe 6 months down the road before they apply for an individual building permit, I think we're changing the game on them. And we need to be willing to then figure out how we're going to compensate them for changing the game in the middle of the road. They've met our specifications, they've got everything approved, they've got budgets, the whole 9 yards, and now we're going to say, well, you got to spend $10,000 more. Too bad, so sad.
Mr. Bond and then Ms. Hoppy.
Well, I think, I think the point is we're saying if they've got a permit, then they've got a permit. If they don't have a permit, and they're coming to pull their permit 15 days after this is decided, then it will go into effect. So it's not in effect for these things. And I think we're a little bit maybe nuanced between a master building permit that says we approve this type of a model, but they actually don't have a permit for that model. When they pull the permit for that model, whatever codes are going to apply, including if they, by the way, if they pull a permit after July 1st, 2020, and all these codes into effect, they're going to have new changes. We're not going to compensate them for that.
Ms. Hoppy?
And no estimate, no building estimate is perpetually valid. You can't get an estimate and then, a year later it'll be perpetually valid. It doesn't happen. And with the way that construction costs are changing these days, if you get an estimate and they say it's good for 60 days, then you're in pretty good shape. But typically it's 30.
I wish I could have gotten that in the line of business I was in. I had to build 7-year projects, and my price was my price.
Ms. Davis.
I would just like to give them a little bit more time than 15 days. I mean, I know it's not that big of a deal. It's a couple things, but I think it's respectful. I mean, I don't know that we have to give them till July, but even if we give them, first quarter 2020 or, something just so that they can plan or, I'm not in construction, but I would at least like to have that flexibility just in a respectful manner. So
a consensus has been made, so if you guys would like to make a consensus to overwrite that, then do it.
Well, I guess the consensus was made thinking that it was with the July date that Ken had said. So I guess my request is to have a new consensus.
I'd like to ask for consensus that after 15 days with adoption, that the radon systems and the solar-ready provisions in which we've discussed in the new building code modifications will apply to all projects there forward.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so that gathers consensus. Okay.
I think that's what we need.
And then I saw another one on here, the National Electrical Code modification, adding language for automatic adoption of the electrical code by the state of Colorado every 3 years.
Yeah, so that's another, I think, just a good suggestion that Randy's made. The state really controls the electrical code. They regulate they license electricians as well. We register them. But the state plays a pretty active role in enforcing the electrical code. They adopt the electrical code on their own, so they adopted the 2014 electrical code, and they basically tell us we have to enforce it.
Correct.
So we're proposing that we just, since they're telling us that we have to enforce it, that we're proposing that it automatically get updated locally when Colorado updates it. So,
do we have discussion on that? Do we have consensus to move forward with that? We do? Okay. Good. Is there any more business to, did you get all the consensus you needed on the first couple of items? We didn't start with that right away, so I just want to make sure that you got all the marching orders that you
I think we did. I mean, I think we're trying not to mar you in too much minutia at the risk of already having done that, but
okay.
We got what we needed.
Okay, then we will thank you for your presentation. Thank you very much for coming and a good presentation. Look forward to seeing this on the dais, and this will be coming back in
December.
November 9th.
November 9th.
Okay. All right, and we'll have a public hearing on this?
Public hearing on December
Okay.
November 25th and December 9th.
I can't wait to be here November, is it November or December 25th?
The first reading is...
November 25th is first reading, and public hearing is December 9th.
Okay. Thank you very much. Our next order of business is item number 4, staff reports. Mr. Goff.
Just real quickly, heard today that Alta will be opening Friday and Sierra Trading Post on Saturday. So,
I thought you said Alta.
Alta.
In the ski area.
Alta. Oh, that may be opening in some areas. Alta, the beauty supply store, Ken, is Friday, and Sierra Trading Post is Saturday.
You're going to have to do your skiing in-state. All right. Thank you very much. Item number 5, elected officials reports. I will go with a hand. Ms. Hoppy.
I just want to let everybody know that on October 22nd, it's a Tuesday at 6:30 at the Rec Center. I'll be having a District 1 meeting. I will be talking about 2E, why I supported it, and 1A, and why I support that. So come on over and have a chat.
Okay. Mr. Matthews.
I have a report here. I have an email from Mr. Goff regarding the noise issue up at Rocky Mountain, and so it's really his thunder. I'll read his email if you'd like me to.
Do it.
Okay. Mr. Goff received an update from Rocky Mountain Bottle Company concerning the mitigation of noise at their plant. Working with Praxair, they have decided on a path forward to help address the noise. Rocky Mountain has received approval from their board for funding, which is estimated in 6 figures, and will involve insulating the oxygenator to decrease the noise volume at the plant. He was not given a specific schedule, but was told that they would be moving quickly to make this happen, and Mr. Goff will be keeping us informed.
Thank you. Additional elected officials matters.
I have 2 questions. Let me go back here. Councilmember Hoppy had this consensus about radon requirements and the extra circuits for solar panels. Did that pass? Okay, and then was there another consensus that failed after that?
It was re-asked and lost a vote.
Re-asked and what?
And then it had lost a vote. So the final is 1, 2, 3, 4,
5.
5.
So first it passed and then it failed.
Just one
It passed
consensus.
with 6 and then it passed with 5.
Okay.
It was reworded.
And the last issue that Mr. Johnstone brought up about when to have these go into effect, what was the result of that? No one said.
The balance of it would go into effect July 1st, 2020. Well, that would be for the
2 items.
For the radon and the electrical circuit breaker, and the rest would go into effect on July 1, 2020. All right?
Oh, okay. Okay, I guess that's good enough.
Okay. Is there
Thank
any
you.
further business to come before our study session? Then we will adjourn. Thank you.